Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never really shared this with many people. For the longest time, I thought no one would believe me. Hell, I barely believe it myself sometimes, but it's been over 30 years now, and I still think about it almost every day. I need to get this off my chest. It was the summer of 1989. I was 27, living in a small apartment in Altadena, working a desk job I hated. The only thing that kept me sane was hiking on weekends in the San Gabriel Mountains. I'd been an amateur wildlife enthusiast since I was a kid, had notebooks full of bird sightings, animal tracks, and plant identifications. Nothing made me happier than being alone in nature, away from phones and people and all the noise. That particular Saturday in July started like any other hiking day. I woke up early around 5:30, packed my small day pack with water, trail mix, a compass, first aid kit, and my trusty binoculars. I remember it was unusually cool for a summer morning in Southern California, maybe 60 degrees with a slight breeze, perfect hiking weather. I'd explored many of the popular trails above Pasadena, but that day I wanted something different. I'd heard about some lesser-known paths near one of the underground water reservoirs in the foothills. The area wasn't officially maintained by park services, but locals knew about these secret trails that wound through the chaparral and oak groves. I parked my old Honda Civic at the end of a residential street where the pavement gave way to dirt. There was no official trailhead, just a worn path heading up into the hills. I checked my watch, 6:45, and started walking. The morning sun was just beginning to warm the earth, and the smell of sage and dry brush filled the air. God, I still remember that smell. Every time I catch a whiff of chaparral, I'm instantly transported back to that day. The first hour or so was uneventful. The trail climbed steadily, switching back and forth across the face of the hill. I passed the concrete structures that marked one of the city's water facilities. Nothing fancy, just some maintenance buildings and fenced-off areas protecting the underground infrastructure. Beyond that, the trail grew narrower, less defined. I had to really pay attention to where I was going. Around 8:30, I stopped for a water break. That's when I first noticed something odd. While I was sitting on a rock, catching my breath, I heard what sounded like footsteps somewhere off the trail. Not animal steps, but the distinct sound of something heavy walking upright. There was also the sound of small rocks being kicked down a slope, that distinctive plink, plink, plink of stones bouncing down a hill. I called out, "Hello?" thinking maybe it was another hiker, but got no response. I didn't think much of it at the time. The hills played tricks with sounds, and I figured it was probably just a deer or maybe some loose rocks settling. I continued up the trail. By 9, I'd reached a steeper section where the path almost disappeared into thick brush. The brambles were dense, scratching at my arms and legs as I pushed through. Sweat was pouring down my back now as the day warmed up. I remember stopping and questioning whether I should turn back, but something drove me forward. Maybe it was just stubbornness, or my need to see what was at the top. After fighting my way through that section for about 30 minutes, the trail suddenly opened up onto a ridge. The view took my breath away. I could see all the way down to the city below, the grid of streets, tiny houses, and beyond to downtown Los Angeles, hazy in the distance. Up here, electrical transmission towers marched across the ridge, their steel frameworks stark against the blue sky. The buzzing of the high-voltage lines was the only sound, besides the occasional cry of a hawk riding the thermals above. I found a flat rock near one of the towers and sat down, pulling out my water bottle and some trail mix. It was peaceful up there, completely isolated. No other hikers, no city noise, just me and the wilderness. I took out my binoculars and scanned the valleys below, watching a red-tailed hawk hunting among the brush. I must have sat there for nearly an hour, just soaking it all in. Around 11, I decided it was time to head back. The sun was high now, and the temperature had climbed into the 80s. I gathered my things and started down the ridge, following the fire road that ran along the top before it descended toward the reservoir areas. That's when it happened. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile down the fire road when I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something moving parallel to me but lower on the hillside. At first, I thought it was another hiker who had found their way up a different trail. I turned to look, and my entire world shifted. What I saw wasn't human, at least not entirely. About 50 yards away, moving through the brush and small trees along a parallel path, was a figure unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was tall, I'd estimate around 6 feet, completely covered in dark, almost black hair. The hair wasn't shaggy like you see in those fake Bigfoot costumes. It was sleek, almost shiny in the sunlight, covering its entire body except for parts of its face. But here's the strangest part. It wasn't just walking. It was... I don't know how to describe it exactly. It was almost dancing down the path. It would leap from one side to another, arms outstretched like it was balancing on a tightrope, then pause, then continue this strange, fluid movement. There was a gracefulness to it that seemed impossible for something that size. I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My first instinct was to run, not away but toward it. I know that sounds insane, but something about the creature's movements didn't seem threatening. It seemed almost playful, childlike. Without really thinking, I started moving toward it, calling out, "Hey! Hello there!" As soon as I spoke, the figure stopped its dancing. It turned toward me. I couldn't make out its features clearly at that distance, but I could feel it looking at me. Then, in one fluid motion, it disappeared down the bushy ridge, moving with incredible speed through terrain that would have had me stumbling and falling. I stood there, stunned. Had I really seen what I thought I saw? Was my mind playing tricks on me? I'd heard stories about mountain lions, but this was no mountain lion. This was something bipedal, something that moved with purpose and awareness. After a few minutes of standing there, trying to process what had happened, I did something that even now I can't fully explain. I called out, "It's okay, you can come back. I won't hurt you." I don't know why I said that. Maybe I didn't want the encounter to end. Maybe I needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. Whatever the reason, what happened next will stay with me until the day I die. The figure reappeared. It came back up through the brush and stepped onto the path about 30 yards from where I stood. In the full sunlight, I could see it clearly. It was a Bigfoot. There's simply no other word for it. The body was powerfully built, with broad shoulders and a slightly stooped posture. The hair covered its entire body in a uniform coat of dark brown, almost black. Its face was flatter than a human's, with a pronounced brow ridge and a wide nose. The eyes were what got me. They weren't animal eyes. They were intelligent, curious, almost human. We stood there, looking at each other for what must have been several minutes but felt like hours. I didn't feel afraid anymore. There was something about its presence that felt peaceful, curious rather than threatening. It made no move toward me, and I made no move toward it. We were just two beings, sharing a moment of recognition on a hillside. Eventually, I realized how late it was getting. I needed to head back down before it got too hot, or I risked being out after dark. I didn't know how to end this strange standoff, how to say goodbye to something that shouldn't exist. Finally, I just raised my right arm in a grand gesture of farewell, sweeping it from above my head down to my side. And then it happened. The thing that makes me question my sanity even after all these years. The Bigfoot mirrored my gesture exactly, raising its arm and sweeping it down in the same motion I had made. It wasn't a mocking imitation. It was perfect, like watching my own reflection. After that, it turned and walked, not ran, just walked normally, away from me toward the fire road. As it moved away, I heard that same strange sound I'd noticed earlier in my hike, a rhythmic chopping or knocking sound that echoed through the hills. The creature disappeared around a bend, and though I waited for almost another hour, I never saw it again. The hike back down was surreal. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it really a Bigfoot, this creature that most scientists dismiss as folklore? Or was it some kind of elaborate hoax? But who would go to the trouble of dressing up in a realistic costume on a remote trail in the middle of nowhere with no audience? And how could they move with such natural grace through that rough terrain? The way it mirrored my gesture, that wasn't something you could plan. I've gone back to that same spot dozens of times over the years. I've never seen the creature again, though sometimes I hear that strange knocking sound in the distance. I've researched Bigfoot sightings extensively since then, read all the accounts and theories I could find. Some dismiss these creatures as bears seen at odd angles or hoaxes perpetrated for attention, but I know what I saw. What stays with me most isn't the shock or the strangeness of the encounter, but the peaceful nature of it. There was no aggression, no fear on the creature's part. It seemed as curious about me as I was about it. The mimicry of my wave wasn't mocking, it felt like communication, like it was trying to connect across the vast gulf that separated our species. That day changed how I see the world. If something like this could exist, practically in the backyard of the second largest city in America, what else might be out there that we don't understand? How many other mysteries are walking just parallel to our daily lives, occasionally crossing paths with us when the conditions are just right? I haven't told many people this story. The few I've shared it with either think I'm crazy or that I'm making it up for attention, but I know what I saw, and 30+ years later, it's still as clear in my mind as if it happened yesterday. That strange dancing figure on the hillside, the intelligent eyes, the perfect mirroring of my goodbye. Sometimes when I'm hiking alone, I still raise my arm in that same farewell gesture, hoping that somewhere in the brush, someone might be raising theirs back at me. So far, it's never happened again, but I keep looking. Story 2. I've held off posting this experience for almost 20 years. Most people who know me consider me pretty damn level-headed. I spent 14 years as a Boy Scout leader and worked for the government for decades before retiring. I'm not prone to flights of fancy or jumping at shadows, but what happened on my property in Dent County, Missouri, back in April of 2005, defies every rational explanation I can think of. I purchased my land, 80 acres bordering Mark Twain National Forest, back in 2002 as my eventual retirement spot. It's beautiful country, rolling hills, thick oak forests, some pine groves, and a seasonal creek that runs through the southern portion. An old logging road cuts through the property, making it relatively easy to access different areas, but it's remote enough that I rarely see another soul when I'm there. For the first couple years, everything was normal. I built a small hunting cabin, nothing fancy, just a place to sleep, cook and stay warm when I came out for weekend hunting trips or to work on clearing trails. But around 2004, I started noticing changes. It started with sounds. I've spent enough time in the woods to recognize the normal forest chorus, owls, coyotes, foxes, even the occasional black bear. What I began hearing didn't fit any of those categories. There were these vocalizations at night, not quite a howl, not quite a scream, that would echo across the property. They'd start from one direction and then be answered from another, like they were communicating. Then came the wood knocks. The first time I heard them, I wrote it off as a woodpecker or maybe a branch falling, but woodpeckers don't work at night, and these knocks had a pattern, always in sets of 3, always answered by another set from a different location. They were deliberate, purposeful. By April 2005, I'd heard enough weird stuff that I decided to start spending more time at the cabin trying to figure out what was going on. The weekend of April 15th was when everything came to a head. I arrived at my property around 4 that Friday afternoon. It was a beautiful spring day. Temperatures in the low 70s, clear skies, mild breeze. I unloaded my truck, got the generator running, and spent the last couple hours of daylight checking my trail cameras and walking the property line. Everything seemed normal. I grilled some burgers outside as the sun went down, had a couple beers, and settled in with a book. The windows were open to let in the cool evening air, and the usual night sounds filtered in. Spring peepers down by the creek, the occasional hoot of a barred owl, crickets doing their thing. Around 10:30 that night, everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't gradual. It was like someone had flipped a switch and killed all sound in the forest. The crickets, frogs, everything just stopped. My first thought was that a predator must be moving through, maybe a bobcat or coyote. That happens sometimes. But then my skin started prickling because the silence lasted too long, way too long. I set my book down and moved to the window, peering out into the darkness. I couldn't see much beyond the small clearing around my cabin. The moon was only a quarter full, and the trees blocked most of that light. That's when I heard it. From the southwest, maybe 400 or 500 yards away, came this... God, I still don't know how to describe it properly. It started as a deep, throaty whoop that rose into a screech that made the hair on my arms stand straight up. It was loud, like it came from something with massive lungs. The sound echoed through the trees and seemed to vibrate the glass in my windows. Before the echo had even died away, another call answered from the southeast. Different pitch, slightly higher, but unmistakably the same kind of vocalization. Back and forth they went, 3 or 4 exchanges, getting more intense with each response. My heart was racing. These weren't animals I recognized. Nothing native to Missouri makes sounds like that. Not deer, not coyotes, not bears. Nothing that size exists here, or shouldn't anyway. Between these calls came the wood knocks. 3 distinct, powerful thwacks from somewhere to the west of my cabin. Pause. Then 3 answering knocks from the east. These weren't random branches falling or animals scurrying around. Each knock was identical in spacing and force, like someone was taking a baseball bat to a tree trunk with deliberate purpose. I'd brought my shotgun, which I always keep at the cabin, and I found myself clutching it as I moved from window to window, trying to see anything moving out there. But the forest was pitch black beyond my clearing. The calls and knocks continued for about 45 minutes. Sometimes they'd move. The southwest caller seemed to circle around to the west, getting slightly closer. The southeast caller stayed more or less in the same area, down near where my creek runs. I never saw anything, but I could track the movement by sound. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything stopped. The silence hung for maybe another 10 minutes before the normal night sounds slowly returned. Crickets first, then frogs, then the occasional owl. By midnight, you'd never have known anything unusual had happened. I barely slept that night. I kept the shotgun next to my bed and woke at every little sound, convinced something was about to crash through my door or window. But nothing did. The next morning, I hiked out to where I thought the sounds had come from. I found nothing conclusive. No footprints I could identify, though the forest floor was mostly covered in dry oak leaves that wouldn't show tracks well anyway. In one area to the west, I found a pine tree with a section of bark missing about 7 feet up the trunk. The exposed wood looked freshly damaged, but I couldn't say for certain it was related to the knocking sounds. I spent most of Saturday cutting firewood and checking my trail cameras. The SD cards showed nothing unusual, just the normal deer, raccoons, and a single image of a coyote. Whatever had been making those sounds had either avoided my cameras or moved through areas where I didn't have any setup. That second night, Saturday, I was on high alert. I kept all the lights off in the cabin after sunset, hoping I might catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. I sat in a chair by the window facing west, shotgun across my lap, just watching and listening. The forest was quieter than normal, but not the dead silence of the previous night. Around 9:30, I heard a few lone wood knocks, but no answering calls. Nothing like the back and forth communication of Friday night. Then, around 11, something happened that I still can't fully process. I was still sitting by the west-facing window when suddenly the moonlight that had been filtering in was blocked, completely blocked. Something massive was standing outside my window. I froze. The cabin is built on a slight rise, and that particular windowsill is about 5 feet off the ground. Whatever was blocking my window had to be at least 7 feet tall, probably taller. The smell hit me next, like wet dog mixed with something musky and wild. It seeped through the slight gap where the window wasn't fully sealed. The odor was so strong it made my eyes water. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just sat there, fingers tightening around my shotgun, trying to make out any details in the darkness. But all I could see was a solid black shape blocking out the night sky and the trees beyond. It stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it moved away. I heard heavy footsteps, 2 or 3, moving away from the cabin, and then nothing. The moment it moved, I sprang into action. I grabbed my flashlight and rushed to the door, throwing it open and shining the beam in the direction of the window. Nothing. I circled the entire cabin, scanning the tree line with my light, listening for any sound of movement in the underbrush. But whatever had been there was gone, moved away with a stealth that seemed impossible for something so large. The next morning, I searched the area around that window meticulously. The ground was covered with leaf litter and pine needles, but I found no distinct footprints. What I did find, however, were several broken branches on the trees near the cabin, broken at a height of about 8 feet off the ground. Fresh breaks, the wood still light-colored and moist where it had snapped. I packed up and left that Sunday, earlier than I'd planned. I've been back to the property many times since then, but never alone, and never without being heavily armed. I've heard similar vocalizations and wood knocks occasionally, always at night, always in that same pattern of call and response. But I've never again had something come right up to my cabin window. I've spent years researching what I experienced that weekend. The vocalizations I heard match countless recordings of what people call Bigfoot calls or Sasquatch screams. The wood knocks are also widely reported by Bigfoot researchers as a form of communication between these creatures. I've talked to a few trusted friends about it, fellow scout leaders, hunting buddies, and gotten mixed reactions. Some think I imagined it, or exaggerated normal forest sounds. Others have shared similar stories, things they've experienced deep in the Ozark forest that they can't explain. I don't know what's living in the woods on and around my property. I don't know if they're what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch or some undocumented species, but I know what I heard, what I smelled, what stood outside my window that night. They were communicating with each other. They were aware of me. And sometimes, when I'm at my cabin and the sun starts to set, I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there, watching and waiting for darkness to fall. Story 3. I've never been able to shake what happened that summer of '79 in St. Peter's. Even now, typing this out with the lights on in my apartment, I get this creeping feeling up my spine. I've read other people's experiences on here, and I finally feel ready to share mine. I was 17 then, and what I saw, what we all saw, by Dardine Creek changed me forever. It started on a muggy July evening. Me and my buddy Rick had nothing better to do, so we headed down to the old railroad bridge that crossed over Dardine Creek. It was our spot, just a quiet place where teenagers could hang out away from parents and talk about girls, music, cars, whatever. The bridge stood about 20 feet above the creek bed, and we'd sit on the edge with our legs dangling, watching the water below. That night was sticky hot, even for Missouri. We'd brought a couple of sodas, and were just shooting the breeze, talking about getting our own apartments after high school. It must have been around 9 o'clock when I first noticed something was off. The bugs had gone quiet on one side of the creek, and I kept getting this weird feeling we were being watched. I remember glancing over my shoulder a few times, scanning the tree line. Rick asked what was wrong, and I brushed it off. Nothing, man. Thought I heard something. But I couldn't shake that feeling. The creek bed below us was mostly dry that summer, just a trickle of water running through the middle. The moonlight hit the exposed muddy banks, casting shadows among the rocks and fallen trees. That's when I noticed movement down there, not like a raccoon or possum, but something bigger shifting in the darkness. "You see that?" I whispered to Rick. He peered over. "See what?" "I don't know. Something moving down there." I pointed toward a cluster of boulders. Rick squinted. "Probably just a deer, dude." I was about to agree when we both heard a splash. Too heavy for a deer. Rick laughed nervously and took another sip of his soda. "I gotta take a leak," he announced, standing up. He walked about 30 feet down the tracks to the end of the bridge, where he could pee off the side into the brush below. I sat there alone, still scanning the creek bed. The moonlight played tricks, making shadows move and shift. Then I heard it, a deep, throaty breathing sound coming from beneath the bridge. Not an animal I recognized. My heart started hammering against my ribs. "Rick!" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy. "You still there, man?" "Yeah, just finishing up," he called back. That's when it happened. I heard the most terrifying sound, timber creaking and splintering. Then Rick screamed, "Daniel, help!" I jumped up and ran toward his voice. When I got to the end of the bridge, what I saw freezes my blood to this day. One of the massive railroad ties at the edge of the bridge was lifted up from below, not sliding, not shifting, but being lifted by something underneath. And reaching through the gap was a hand, not a human hand. It had 3 massive fingers with curved claws, like eagle talons, but bigger, much bigger. The skin was leathery dark, and it was stretching up toward Rick's ankle. Rick was scrambling backward on his ass, his pants still half down. "What the fuck?" he screamed. I grabbed his arm and yanked him up. "Run!" We bolted down those tracks faster than I've ever moved in my life. The sound that came from behind us, I'll never forget it. It wasn't a growl or a roar. It was almost like a scream, but deeper, like a mountain lion's cry, amplified 10 times over. We didn't stop running until we reached the main road, a good mile away. We collapsed on the sidewalk, gasping for breath. Rick's face was ghost white. What the fuck was that?" he panted. "I don't know, man. I don't know." But deep down I had a suspicion. The stories my grandpa used to tell about the woods, the local legends, Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. We didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe us? Just a couple of teenagers making up stories, they'd say. But I couldn't stop thinking about those 3 fingers and those claws. That wasn't in any Bigfoot story I'd ever heard. A week passed before I worked up the courage to go back. This time, I brought 3 friends. Rick, who took serious convincing, along with Mike and Jason. We went in broad daylight, armed with baseball bats and a camera. Stupid teenagers, thinking we were prepared for anything. We approached the bridge cautiously, scanning the tree line. The creek bed looked normal in the daylight, just mud, rocks, and sparse water. We climbed down the embankment to look underneath the bridge. That's when we found the handprints. In the mud along the bank were massive impressions, 3-fingered handprints with distinct claw marks at the tips. Each print was easily twice the size of my hand, and I don't have small hands. They led from the water to the bridge supports, where we found more of them. Dark, muddy smears on the steel beams, as if something huge had climbed up. "Holy shit," whispered Mike, who'd been skeptical the whole way there. "What could make prints like that?" Jason was snapping photos with his camera. "This is insane." Rick wouldn't even come down from the tracks. He stood up there, keeping watch and looking like he might bolt any second. We spent about an hour documenting everything. The prints, the scratches on the metal, even what looked like hair caught on a nail, coarse, dark brown strands, too thick to be human or deer. I was examining one of the larger prints when I heard Mike's camera stop clicking. I looked up to see him frozen, staring across the creek into the dense trees on the other side. "Guys," he said, his voice barely audible, "don't move." I turned slowly and felt my stomach drop. Standing partially hidden in the tree line, watching us, was the tallest figure I'd ever seen. It was hard to make out details in the shadows, but it had to be 8 or 9 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark brown matted hair. The shoulders on this thing, Jesus, they must have been 5 feet wide. I could barely make out eyes beneath a heavy brow, and its neck was practically non-existent. The head just seemed to sit directly on those massive shoulders. But what struck me most were the arms. They hung down, way down, past its knees. Those 3-fingered hands dangling at its sides, claws catching the sunlight. None of us moved, none of us breathed. It was just staring at us, and we were staring back. Then Rick, still up on the bridge, spotted it too. "Guys, run!" he screamed. The creature's head snapped up toward Rick's voice, and it made that sound again, that deep, penetrating scream that vibrated in my chest cavity. We scrambled up the embankment like our lives depended on it, because I'm pretty damn sure they did. As I reached the top, I looked back in time to see the creature move. It didn't run like a person. It covered ground in these massive, loping strides, reaching a fallen tree, a huge dead oak, at least 3 feet in diameter. And with one hand, it pushed it over like it was nothing more than a broomstick. The crash echoed through the creek bed as we sprinted down the tracks. When we got back to town, we were all shaking. Jason's photos didn't come out clearly, just blurry shapes in the trees that could be dismissed as shadows or branches. No one would believe us without proof. But we went back. That's the crazy part. We kept going back, drawn by some morbid curiosity or the teenage delusion of invincibility. Over the next month, we spotted it 3 more times, always from a distance. We'd parked near the creek but away from the bridge, using binoculars to watch the area. On our 4th stakeout, we saw something else. The big one, the male we assumed, was by the water, digging at something in the creek bed. Then movement caught my eye further up the bank. A smaller figure emerged from what must have been a cave or den hidden in the embankment. It was similar in appearance but much smaller, maybe 5 to 6 feet tall. Its hair was lighter in color, more of a reddish brown. "Holy shit," Jason whispered. "There's a female." Then, to our absolute shock, 2 even smaller figures came out behind her. Cubs? Babies? I don't know what you'd call them, but they were unmistakably the same species, miniature versions of the adults, about 3 feet tall, with the same proportions. "It's a family," I said, my mouth dry. "They're living here." Mike looked pale. "If that's a family, they're going to be protective. We need to stop coming here." He was right, of course. We were messing with something we couldn't understand, something that could clearly kill us without much effort. That massive male had lifted railroad ties and pushed over trees like they were nothing. If it decided we were a threat to its family. We agreed to stop our research, but I went back one more time on my own. I don't know what I was thinking. Maybe I wanted proof that no one could dismiss. Maybe I was just stupid. I went at dusk, hiding in the bushes near where we'd spotted them before. I waited for almost 2 hours. The sun had fully set when I heard twigs snapping behind me. I spun around, and there it was. The male, standing less than 20 feet away. In the fading light, I could see details I'd missed before. Its face wasn't ape-like, as Bigfoot is often described. It was more primitive human, with a flatter nose and heavy brow. Those eyes, small, deep-set and intelligent, were fixed right on me. It knew I'd been watching its family. It knew who I was. I didn't run. I couldn't. My legs wouldn't work. The creature took one step toward me, then stopped. It tilted its head slightly, like it was studying me. Then it lifted one of those massive three-fingered hands and pointed at me, then back toward town. The message couldn't have been clearer. Go, leave, don't come back. I nodded, my whole body trembling. It watched as I slowly backed away, then turned and walked into the deeper forest. I didn't run until it was out of sight. Then I sprinted all the way to my car and drove home with the doors locked, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I never went back to that spot again. None of us did. We made a pact not to tell anyone what we'd seen. Who would believe us? We'd be the laughingstock of St. Peter's. But we knew what was living by Dardine Creek. Years passed. I moved away after college, but I've kept tabs on the area. Development eventually reached that part of St. Peter's. The old bridge was torn down in the late 80s, and housing development sprung up along what used to be dense forest. I've often wondered what happened to that family when the bulldozers came. Did they move deeper into whatever wilderness was left? Did they survive at all? I still have nightmares about those three-fingered hands reaching through the railroad ties, those claws stretching toward my friend's ankle. I still wake up in a cold sweat hearing that scream echoing in my head. I've read accounts from all over the country since then, Bigfoot sightings, Sasquatch encounters, but none of them mention the three-fingered hands or the eagle-like claws. None of them talk about families living together in hidden dens. Sometimes I wonder if what we saw wasn't Bigfoot at all, but something else entirely. Something science hasn't classified, something that's still out there, watching from the shadows. I'm 47 years old now, and I've never told this story publicly until today. But I know what I saw. I know what my friends and I experienced that summer, and sometimes when I'm driving through rural areas at night and pass a creek with a bridge, I can't help but slow down and scan the tree line, wondering if something with three fingers and inhuman strength is watching me from the darkness. Story 4. I've been working as a wildlife photographer and outdoor guide for almost 15 years in the Pacific Northwest, so I know the woods like the back of my hand. I've encountered black bears, mountain lions, even had a standoff with an angry bull elk once. But nothing prepared me for what happened 3 weeks ago in the Olympic National Forest. I still haven't told many people about this. My girlfriend thinks I'm making it up, and I can't blame her. If someone told me this story a month ago, I'd think they were full of it too. It was the 3rd week of September, and I decided to take advantage of those last perfect hiking days before the weather turned. I'd been planning to explore an area about 20 miles west of Lake Cushman, a part of the forest I knew existed but had never actually visited. The rangers at the station told me it was pretty isolated, which was exactly what I wanted. I packed light, my one-person tent, sleeping bag, water filter, 3 days of food, first aid kit, my camera gear, and the usual survival stuff. I've always been careful about being prepared, but I've never felt scared in the woods. If anything, I've always felt more at home there than in the city. The first day and a half of hiking were uneventful but beautiful. The fall colors were just starting to show, with the maples turning fiery red against the deep green of the conifers. I set up my base camp near a small stream in a clearing, with the plan to use it as a hub for day hikes in different directions. It was on my second full day that everything happened. I left camp around noon after having a quick lunch of beef jerky and trail mix. The weather was perfect, about 60 degrees, crisp air, not a cloud in the sky. I decided to head northeast, following game trails when I could find them. I wasn't in any rush, stopping often to photograph interesting fungi, a few late-blooming wildflowers, and some interesting rock formations. By about 4 in the afternoon, I'd hiked maybe a mile from my camp. The forest was getting denser, with old-growth Douglas firs and western hemlocks stretching up like columns. The forest floor was thick with ferns and moss, and the light filtered through the canopy in these beautiful shafts that any photographer would kill to capture. I remember checking my GPS to mark the spot, thinking I might come back for some early morning shots the next day. That's when I saw the first orb. I've spent enough time in the woods to know there are perfectly natural explanations for most strange phenomena. Swamp gas, bioluminescent fungi, even certain spiders' eyes can catch the light in weird ways. But this was different. About 30 yards ahead of me, floating about 6 feet off the ground, was what I can only describe as a luminous sphere. It was roughly the size of a grapefruit, giving off this pulsing white-blue light that seemed to come from within. It wasn't blinding, more like the glow of those high-end LED flashlights, but softer around the edges. And the weirdest part? It was moving with purpose, weaving between trees, pausing occasionally as if examining something. I honestly thought I was hallucinating at first. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, even pinched my arm, but it was still there. I pulled out my camera instinctively, but my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't get a decent shot. As I was fumbling with the settings, a second orb appeared from behind a massive cedar. This one was smaller, maybe baseball-sized, and had a more amber color to it. It flickered like a candle flame, but stayed perfectly intact as it moved. The two orbs began what looked almost like a dance, circling each other, then separating to move in different directions, only to meet up again. I finally managed to steady my hands enough to snap a few photos, but when I checked the display, all I could see were blurry streaks of light. Nothing like what I was seeing with my naked eyes. For about 5 minutes I just stood there, rooted to the spot, watching these things move through the forest. They never came closer to me, staying within that 30-yard range, moving horizontally through the trees. Then, simultaneously, they both just winked out. 1 second they were there, the next, nothing. No fading, no zooming away, just gone. I stayed frozen for another minute, waiting to see if they'd reappear. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've never believed in UFOs or anything paranormal, but I couldn't think of any rational explanation for what I'd just witnessed. After they disappeared, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. That constant background noise of the woods, birds, insects, the rustle of small animals, had gone silent. I remember thinking how wrong it felt. In all my years outdoors, I've learned that when the forest goes quiet, it usually means there's a predator nearby. I decided to head back to camp. I turned around to get my bearings, and that's when the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you just know you're being watched? It was like that, but amplified 100 times. My mouth went dry, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. Slowly, I turned back toward where the orbs had been. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just the dense forest. Then, my eyes locked onto a dark shape, partially hidden behind a massive Douglas fir, about 30 yards away, exactly where the orbs had been floating. It took my brain a second to process what I was seeing. At first, I thought it might be a bear standing on its hind legs, but as my eyes adjusted and I really focused, I realized it was something else entirely. The creature was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It had a massive, bulky frame covered in dark brown hair or fur that looked matted in some places and longer in others. Its shoulders were enormously wide and sloped down to powerful-looking arms that hung lower than a human's would. The face was what really got to me. It was set deep under a prominent brow ridge, with dark, deeply recessed eyes that I could barely make out in the shadows. But I could feel them watching me, studying me. I've seen plenty of wildlife documentaries about Sasquatch and read the reports, so I knew immediately what I was looking at. But knowing something exists intellectually and actually standing 30 yards away from one are completely different things. My mind was racing between total disbelief and absolute terror. The creature didn't move aggressively or make any sound that I could hear. It just observed me from behind that tree, with only about 2/3 of its body visible. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. It felt like we were locked in some kind of primitive standoff that lasted forever, but was probably only about 30 seconds. What struck me most was how intelligent those eyes seemed. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. There was a consciousness there, observing me with what felt like curiosity rather than hunger or aggression. In that moment, I understood why native tribes have always considered these beings to be more than just animals. Then something strange happened. The creature's head suddenly turned, looking away from me and toward something in the distance that I couldn't see or hear. Its posture changed slightly, becoming more alert. Then, with a deliberate movement that seemed almost casual, it simply stepped backward and disappeared behind the tree. I expected to see it emerge on the other side. That tree wasn't nearly wide enough to hide something so large, but it never did. I stood there for another minute or two, my legs trembling so badly I thought I might collapse. Finally, I managed to force myself to move, backing away slowly at first, then turning and walking as fast as I could without actually running back toward my camp. The entire mile back, I kept looking over my shoulder, convinced I was being followed. I heard crashes in the underbrush a few times that sounded too heavy to be deer, but I never saw the creature again. When I finally reached my camp, I immediately packed up my essential gear, leaving my tent and some supplies behind. There was no way I was spending another night out there alone. The 4-mile hike back to my car in the fading light was the most terrifying experience of my life. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding a 7-foot beast, and every sound made me jump. I made it back to the parking area just as true darkness was setting in, threw my backpack in the trunk, and drove straight home without stopping. It wasn't until I was back in my apartment with the doors locked that I really started to process what had happened. The Sasquatch sighting alone would have been enough to shake me to my core, but it was the orbs that really messed with my head. I've been obsessively researching since then, and I found a few obscure reports from other hikers and campers in the Pacific Northwest who claim to have seen strange lights in areas known for Sasquatch sightings. Some theories suggest there's some kind of technology used by these creatures. Others think they might be a natural phenomenon that attracts them, like how certain bioluminescent fungi might attract animals. A few of the wilder theories suggest the orbs and the creatures are connected in some interdimensional way that we don't understand. I don't know what to believe. All I know is what I saw, and the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Those orbs disappeared seconds before I spotted the Sasquatch in exactly the same location. There has to be a connection. I tried showing the rangers my photos when I reported the encounter, but as I mentioned, they just showed blurry streaks of light that could have been anything. The ranger gave me that look, the one that says, "Another hiker with an overactive imagination," and politely took my report. I doubt anything will come of it. I haven't been back to the woods since that day. I've cancelled 2 guided trips I was supposed to lead, making excuses about equipment issues. I know I'll have to go back eventually. It's my livelihood and my passion, but right now I can't bring myself to do it. Not until I can make sense of what I experienced. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't just the fact that Sasquatch exists, as crazy as that sounds. It's the implication that there might be so much more to these creatures than we ever imagined. If they're connected to these strange phenomena, to these lights that seem to defy the laws of physics as we understand them, then what else don't we know? What else is out there in the forests we think we know so well? I've always felt at home in the wilderness, but now I can't help but feel like I've been a guest all along, unaware of who or what was really watching me from the shadows. Story 5. I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw last spring during tornado season. I've lived in rural Kansas my entire life, same property my grandfather farmed before me, and I've seen pretty much everything from coyotes to mountain lions passing through over the years. But this was different. This was something I can't explain no matter how many times I turn it over in my head. It happened in early May, about 14 months ago. The weather had been unstable all week, which isn't unusual for Kansas in spring. The local meteorologists had been warning about a system moving in from the southwest that had tornado potential. I'd been through dozens of tornado warnings over the years, and while I never take them lightly, they're just part of life here. That afternoon, around 4 o'clock, I noticed the sky starting to change. There was this eerie green-gray color developing, and the air felt heavy and thick, like you could cut it with a knife. The humidity was probably pushing 90%, making everything feel sticky. You know that feeling when there's so much electricity in the air that the hair on your arms stands up? That's exactly what was happening. My skin was practically buzzing. I decided to do a quick check around the property before the worst hit. We'd had some close calls with tornadoes over the years, and I've learned it's best to secure anything that might become a missile in high winds. My farm is about 80 acres, with the house and main barn situated near the road, and stretches back to a line of trees that separates my property from the Wilsons' land. There's a creek that runs along that tree line, usually not much more than a trickle, but it swells up when we get heavy rain. I'd already tied down what I could in the barn and garage, so I jumped in my old F-150 to drive the back fields. The wind was really picking up at this point, gusting strong enough to rock the truck on its suspension. The radio was crackling with static, but I could make out the emergency broadcast system warning about a severe thunderstorm watch escalated to a tornado watch for our county. I drove along the dirt track that cuts through my soybean fields to the back of the property. I was planning to check if any of the drainage ditches were clogged with debris, which could lead to flooding if we got the rainfall they were predicting. That's when I noticed the pressure in my ears changing, that unmistakable feeling when a major storm system is approaching. As I neared the back tree line, I stopped the truck and got out, thinking I might need to clear some branches that had fallen across one of the drainage channels. I remember looking up at the sky and seeing these massive churning clouds moving in this unnatural way. The wind was making this low moaning sound through the trees. That's when I saw it, movement along the tree line about 200 yards to my right. At first glance, I thought it was probably a deer. We get plenty of them around here, especially when bad weather is coming. They seem to sense it and move to find better shelter. But this wasn't a deer. As I focused my eyes, I realized whatever I was looking at was walking upright. For a split second, I thought maybe it was one of the Wilson boys from the neighboring property, but it quickly became clear this was much taller than any person I'd ever seen. And the way it moved, it wasn't human. I stood frozen next to my truck, watching as this creature stepped fully out of the tree cover. It was huge. I'm guessing at least 7 feet tall, maybe even taller. It had broad shoulders and was covered in dark hair or fur, sort of a deep brown that looked almost black against the strange greenish sky. The hair seemed longer around the shoulders and shorter on the limbs. What strikes me most, even now, was how it moved. It didn't lumber or shamble like you might expect something that big to move. It moved with this fluid, athletic stride, powerful but efficient. I've been an avid hunter my whole life, and I've never seen any animal move quite like that. It had purpose. It knew exactly where it was going. The creature paused for just a moment at the edge of the trees, and I swear it looked in my direction. I was about 100 yards away, but I'm positive it saw me. It didn't seem startled or aggressive, just aware. Then it took off across this open stretch of fallow field. The speed was incredible. It crossed what must have been 100 yards in seconds, reaching another patch of woods that borders the creek. I remember my pulse pounding in my ears and this sense of unreality washing over me. I've spent 56 years in these fields. I know every inch of this land, and I had never seen anything remotely like this before. The air temperature suddenly dropped about 10 degrees, and I felt the first fat raindrops hitting my face. The sky was getting darker by the second. Whatever I'd just witnessed seemed to know the storm was coming. It was moving with urgency, like it was seeking better shelter before all hell broke loose. I got back in my truck, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I kept looking toward where the creature had disappeared, half expecting it to emerge again. But there was nothing but the trees bending in the increasingly violent wind. I made it back to the house just as the rain started coming down in sheets. The weather radio was blaring tornado warnings, and within 20 minutes, the sirens in town started wailing. I went down to the storm cellar. My grandfather built it in the 1950s, and it saved my life more than once. As I sat there with my emergency supplies and the battery-powered radio, all I could think about was what I'd seen. That night was one of the worst storms we've had in years. We got ping-pong ball-sized hail, winds that took down half the big maple in my front yard, and nearly 5 inches of rain in just a few hours. The tornado touched down about 4 miles east of my place, tearing up the Johnson farm pretty bad, though thankfully nobody was hurt. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature, its fluid movement, the way it seemed to know exactly where it needed to go. First thing the next morning, I went back to where I'd seen it. The ground was completely saturated, mud everywhere. The creek had overflowed its banks, and there was debris scattered all through the wooded areas. Any tracks that might have been there were long gone, washed away by the deluge. I walked the entire stretch where I'd seen it cross, hoping to find something. Broken branches, tufts of hair, anything that would confirm what I'd witnessed. But there was nothing, just mud and storm debris. I've been replaying that sighting in my head for over a year now. The timing can't be coincidence. That thing, and I'm as certain as I can be that it was what people call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, was moving deliberately in advance of the storm. It knew the weather was turning dangerous before the tornado sirens even sounded. I've read about animals sensing natural disasters before they happen, elephants that move to higher ground before tsunamis, dogs that get agitated before earthquakes. Maybe these creatures have that same sense, but more developed. Maybe that's how they've managed to stay mostly hidden from us all these years. They know when and how to move to avoid danger, whether that danger is natural or human. I haven't told many people what I saw. My wife knows and my son, but that's about it. People around here are practical. They'd think I was making things up, or that the strange light before the storm played tricks on my eyes. But I know what I saw. I've spent my entire life observing wildlife, tracking deer, hunting turkey. I know the difference between a bear, a man, or something else entirely. Since that day, I've kept a trail camera pointed at that section of woods. I check it religiously every week. So far, nothing unusual has shown up. But during severe weather, I find myself looking toward those trees, wondering if it's out there, sensing the changes in barometric pressure and moving to find safer ground. I've been farming this land my whole life, but now I look at those woods differently. I thought I knew every creature that called this area home, but clearly I was wrong. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that have maybe been here longer than us, living alongside us but just out of sight. The next big storm that came through, about 3 weeks later, I found myself standing on my back porch watching those trees as the sky darkened. I didn't see anything that time, but I felt something, this awareness that I wasn't alone, that I was being observed just as intently as I was observing. What haunts me most isn't fear, it's curiosity. Where does it go during these storms? Does it have some kind of shelter? Are there more of them? Do they communicate about the weather somehow? How have they managed to stay hidden from us for so long? I keep searching those woods, especially before storms. I keep my camera ready. I want proof, not for anyone else, just for myself. I want to know that I'm not crazy, that what I saw was real. Because if it was real, if these creatures are out there living alongside us, it changes everything I thought I knew about this land I've spent my entire life on. Sometimes at dusk, when the light gets strange and the shadows in the trees start to blend together, I'll catch movement out of the corner of my eye. it's probably just deer or coyotes or even my imagination playing tricks. But part of me wonders if it's watching me, studying my patterns the way I'm trying to study its. That tornado season changed me, not just because of what I saw, but because it made me realize how little we actually know about the world around us. We think we've catalogued and categorized everything, but we haven't. There are things out there, intelligent things, that have managed to stay just beyond our understanding. I still check the weather obsessively now, not just because I'm a farmer and I need to protect my crops, but because I know that when those severe storms come rolling across the plains, something else is out there, feeling the electricity in the air, sensing the drop in pressure, and moving with purpose to stay safe. And sometimes, if I'm in the right place at the right time, maybe I'll see it again. Maybe next time I'll be quick enough to get evidence that others will believe. Until then, I'll keep watching the tree line during tornado season, and I'll keep wondering what else might be out there, just beyond what we think we know. Story 6. It's been close to 30 years, but I still think about what I saw that day, and I still get goosebumps. Most people I've told just laugh about it, but I know what I saw. Even back then, as a 12-year-old kid, I knew I wasn't making it up or imagining things. This happened in the spring of 1994, when I was in 6th grade at Ridgemont Elementary in northern Minnesota. Our science teacher, Mrs. Holden, had organized a field trip to the Northwoods Nature Center about an hour away from our school. It was supposed to be educational, learning about local plants, animals, and ecosystems. But for me, it turned into something I've been trying to make sense of ever since. I remember being super excited about the trip. I was that kid who was always collecting bugs, picking up weird rocks, and watching nature documentaries. My dad used to take me fishing and camping a lot, so I loved being outdoors. The day of the field trip was perfect, sunny, but not too hot. Maybe around 60 degrees. We'd been having a wet spring, but that day the sky was clear blue. We arrived at the nature center around 10 in the morning. It was this wooden building surrounded by miles of hiking trails that went deep into the forest. The center itself was pretty cool, with exhibits of stuffed animals, information boards about local wildlife, and a little gift shop where I remember wanting to buy a carved wooden bear but didn't have enough money. After looking around the center for about 30 minutes, we split into 2 groups for the trail hikes. Each group had about 10 kids plus a teacher and a nature guide. Our guide was this bearded guy named Mike, who seemed to know everything about every plant and animal. He wore this green vest with tons of pockets and had binoculars hanging around his neck. The trail we took was called the Ridge Trail because it followed along a ridge that overlooked a small valley. On one side of the trail was a steep hill that went down to a creek, and on the other side was more forest. The trees were mostly pine and birch, not fully leafed out yet since it was early spring. For the first 45 minutes or so, everything was normal. Mike kept stopping to point out different plants or bird nests. He showed us these tiny purple wildflowers and explained how some Native Americans used them for medicine. He pointed out woodpecker holes in dead trees and showed us how to identify different animal tracks in the muddy parts of the trail. Most of the other kids were only half paying attention. My friend Tyler kept trying to push another kid named Brandon into muddy spots, and 2 girls, Amber and Jessica, were giggling about some boy band the whole time. Mrs. Holden had to keep shushing everyone and reminding us to listen. I was actually interested in what Mike was saying, so I stayed toward the front of the group. We came to this part of the trail where the ridge opened up a bit, giving us a view across the small valley. There was the creek at the bottom. Then the land rose again on the other side into more forest, but it was less dense over there. You could see between the trees more easily. Mike was explaining something about the different zones of vegetation when I happened to glance across the valley. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a person walking through the trees on the opposite ridge, maybe a hiker or another park ranger. But something seemed off right away. This figure was huge, way taller than any normal person. It was moving between the trees, walking upright on 2 legs, but there was something about the way it moved that didn't look human. I remember freezing in place, just staring. The thing was dark brown, almost black, and covered in what looked like hair or fur. It wasn't wearing clothes, that much was clear. The head was weird, kind of pointed at the top, or maybe conical, not round like a person's head. And its arms, that's what really got to me. They were super long, hanging down almost to its knees, and they swung in this exaggerated way as it walked. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds as it moved steadily between the trees. It never looked in our direction, it just kept walking with these long, smooth strides. Then it moved into a thicker part of the forest and disappeared from view. My heart was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to yell or point or grab someone, but I was just frozen. By the time I managed to tug on Mike's sleeve, whatever I'd seen was gone. "What is it, Lucas?" he asked. I saw something over there," I stammered, pointing across the valley. Something big was walking through the trees. Mike raised his binoculars and scanned the area, but there was nothing to see anymore. "Probably a deer," he said with a smile. "They're all over these woods." "No, it was walking on 2 legs," I insisted. "Like a person, but bigger, much bigger." That got Tyler's attention. "Like Bigfoot?" he said, and then made this stupid howling noise that made the other kids laugh. "It wasn't a deer," I said firmly, "and it wasn't a person either. It was huge and had really long arms." Mrs. Holden gave me that look teachers give when they think you're making stuff up for attention. "Lucas, let's focus on the tour, please. We have a lot more trail to cover." I could tell nobody believed me, and the worst part was, I couldn't prove what I'd seen because it was already gone. Mike had already moved on to talking about some kind of moss growing on the rocks, and the group followed him. I kept staring across the valley, hoping it would reappear, but it didn't. For the rest of the hike, I barely heard anything Mike was saying. I kept looking around nervously, wondering if there were more of these creatures in the woods. I kept thinking about how big it was. It had to be at least 7 or 8 feet tall. And those arms, those weren't human arms. The proportions were all wrong. When we got back to the nature center for lunch, I tried telling a few of my friends what I'd seen, but they just laughed or rolled their eyes. Tyler suggested maybe it was just a bear standing on its hind legs, but I've seen bears before on camping trips with my dad. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't have that body shape, and they don't walk smoothly on 2 legs for that long. On the bus ride home, I sat alone and just stared out the window at the passing forest, wondering if there were more of these things living out there. I felt this weird mix of excitement and fear. I'd seen something that I wasn't supposed to see, something most people don't believe is real. When I got home that afternoon, I couldn't wait to tell my dad. He picked me up from school, and as soon as we got in the car, I blurted out the whole story. I described exactly what I saw: the height, the color, the weird pointed head, the long arms. I was so sure he'd believe me. My dad was always telling me stories about strange things in the woods, like the time he swore he saw lights hovering over the lake when he was fishing at night. But instead of being excited or impressed, he just kind of chuckled and ruffled my hair. "Sounds like you saw a park ranger in a dark uniform, buddy," he said. "Or maybe another hiker with walking sticks. Your imagination probably just ran wild with it." "Dad, I know what I saw," I insisted. "It wasn't human. It was way too big and it had fur all over it." He gave me this patient smile. "Lucas, there are no monsters in those woods. The nature center has thousands of visitors every year. If there was a Bigfoot living there, don't you think someone would have proven it by now?" I slumped back in my seat, feeling defeated. Even my dad didn't believe me, and he was usually on my side about everything. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that thing walking between the trees, its long arms swinging. I tried drawing what I saw in my notebook, but I'm not a great artist, and the pictures didn't capture how strange and scary it looked. I was so frustrated that I'd seen something this incredible, and I couldn't make anyone believe me. The next day at school, Tyler had told everyone that I claimed to see Bigfoot, and kids kept making jokes. They called me Bigfoot Boy for weeks afterward. Mrs. Holden even pulled me aside once to ask if I was still having fantasies about the field trip. It was humiliating, and eventually I just stopped talking about it altogether. But I never forgot what I saw. As I got older, I started researching Bigfoot sightings on my own. This was before the internet was in every home, so I'd go to the library and check out books about cryptids and unexplained phenomena. I'd read accounts from other people who'd seen similar creatures, and it gave me chills how closely their descriptions matched what I saw. The height, the pointed head, the long arms, the smooth walking gait. These were people from all over the country who didn't know each other, yet they were describing the same thing I saw. When the internet became more accessible in the late 90s, I found online forums where people shared their encounters. Some of the stories were obviously fake or exaggerated, but others felt genuine. There were detailed accounts from hunters, hikers, forestry workers, regular people who had nothing to gain from making up stories, and many of them described seeing exactly what I saw. I learned that the area around the nature center had a history of strange sightings going back decades. There were reports of weird howls at night, massive footprints found along creek beds, and even stories from local Native American tribes about forest people who lived in the deepest parts of the woods. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that what I saw that day was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I wasn't crazy, and I wasn't making it up. I even went back to the nature center a few times in my late teens when I got my driver's license. I hiked that same ridge trail, hoping to see the creature again or find some evidence that it existed. I never did, though I swear one time I heard wood knocking sounds deep in the forest that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. I'm 39 years old now, with kids of my own. I've told them about what I saw that day, even though my wife thinks I'm filling their heads with nonsense. But I want them to keep an open mind about the world and understand that there are still mysteries out there, things science hasn't explained yet. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd had a camera that day. This was years before everyone had phones with cameras in their pockets. Would a photo have convinced people? Or would they have just said it was fake or a person in a costume? I guess I'll never know. What I do know is that for a brief moment on that spring day in 1994, I saw something that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. I saw it with my own eyes, clear as day, in broad daylight. It wasn't a shadow or a trick of light. It wasn't a bear or a hiker or a guy in a costume playing a prank. It was something else, something unknown. That experience changed me. It made me question what we think we know about the world. If something like that could exist without being officially documented, what else might be out there that we don't know about? I don't expect anyone reading this to believe me either. I've gotten used to the eye rolls and the "sure you did" comments when I occasionally share my story, but I know what I saw, and nothing will ever convince me otherwise. So if you're ever hiking in the northern Minnesota forests, especially around dusk, when the light starts to fade and the shadows grow longer, keep your eyes open. Pay attention to that feeling when the hair stands up on the back of your neck for no apparent reason. Listen for unusual sounds that don't quite match the normal forest ambience. Because they're out there. I've seen one with my own eyes, and to this day I still scan the tree line whenever I'm in the woods, hoping for a second glimpse of something that most people will go their whole lives without seeing. Story 7. I've been hesitant to share this experience for years because I know what people will think. I'm a rational person. I work in healthcare. I have a college degree, and I've never believed in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. But what happened that afternoon in Lundo, Missouri, changed everything I thought I understood about our world. This happened about 7 years ago when my son Clayton was 4. My parents have this small trailer home in Lundo. It's pretty isolated, sitting on about 3 acres with woods surrounding most of the property. They've lived there since I was in high school, and I visit them a few times a year with my son. It was early October, and the weather was unusually warm that day, probably around 75 degrees. Clayton and I had driven down from St. Louis for the weekend to visit my parents. My dad had gone into town for supplies, and my mum was inside taking a nap. Clayton was playing with some toy trucks on the back deck, and I was just sitting in one of those plastic lawn chairs, scrolling through my phone. Our family dog, Buddy, he's a middle-aged beagle mix, was lying under my chair enjoying the sunshine. The deck faces a large clearing that extends maybe 100 yards before the tree line starts. My parents have this little decorative fence about 30 feet from the deck. It doesn't actually enclose anything, it's just one of those country decorations my mum loves. It was around 3 in the afternoon. I remember looking at the time on my phone just before it happened. Clayton was making vrooming noises with his trucks, and I was half watching him, half checking social media. That's when I noticed something moving at the edge of the tree line. At first, I thought it was a person, maybe a hunter who had wandered onto my parents' property, or a neighbor coming over, but as I focused on it, something felt off. The way it moved wasn't quite right. It was walking upright, but there was something about its gait that made my skin prickle. As it moved further into the clearing, I realized what was wrong. It was covered in hair. Long white hair that caught the sunlight. Not clothing, not a jacket or a coat. Hair. My heart started hammering in my chest. I'm not someone who panics easily. I've worked in emergency rooms. I've dealt with crisis situations. But in that moment, every instinct in my body screamed danger. Clayton, honey, let's go inside, I said, trying to keep my voice casual. I didn't want to scare him. But Mommy, I'm playing, he protested, pushing one of his trucks along the deck railing. I know, sweetie, but let's get a snack. We can come back out in a little bit. I stood up and grabbed his hand, probably a little too forcefully because he looked up at me with surprise. The creature was still a good distance away, but it was definitely coming toward the trailer, toward us. I scooped Clayton up and moved quickly to the back door, sliding it open and stepping inside. I set Clayton down in the kitchen. Go find Grandma and see if she's awake, I told him, and thankfully he ran off down the hallway without arguing. It wasn't until he was gone that I realized Buddy hadn't followed us in. I peered back through the glass door and saw him still under the chair where I'd been sitting. But he wasn't relaxed anymore. His entire body was rigid, and he was making this low, continuous growl that I'd never heard from him before. He was staring directly at the approaching figure, his eyes wide, ears flat against his head. I cracked the door open. "Buddy, come!" I hissed, but he wouldn't move. It was like he was frozen in place, except for the trembling I could see running through his body. The creature was much closer now, maybe 60 yards away. I could see it more clearly, and what I saw made my mouth go dry. It was walking on 2 legs, completely upright like a human, but it was covered from head to toe in brilliant white hair or fur. Not dirty or matted like you might expect from a wild animal. It was almost shimmering in the sunlight, flowing as it walked. The hair was longer in some places, particularly around the shoulders and head. I stood paralyzed behind the glass door, unable to look away. I should have been terrified, and part of me was, but there was also this weird sense of fascination. The creature wasn't charging or behaving aggressively. It was just walking, almost casually, as if it belonged there. Buddy's growling had turned to barking now, sharp, frightened barks, but he still wouldn't move from under that chair. The creature didn't seem bothered by the noise. It didn't change its pace or direction. As it got closer, I could make out more details. It wasn't as tall as I initially thought, maybe between 5 and 6 feet, which surprised me because I'd always imagined Bigfoot, and yes, that's what my brain was screaming it had to be, would be much taller. Its body was proportioned differently than a human's, with longer arms and a slightly stooped posture despite walking upright. The white hair covering it gave me the impression it was old. I know that doesn't make sense. How would I know the age of something I'd never seen before? But something about it just read as elderly to me. Maybe it was the way it moved, deliberate but not slow. Or maybe it was just the white coloring. It reached the decorative fence my mom had installed and stopped. It seemed to be looking for something on the ground. It would take a few steps, pause, then bend down slightly, as if examining the earth. This went on for several minutes while I stood frozen at the door, my heart in my throat. Buddy had retreated further under the chair, still barking, but it was more whimpering now. The creature was about 30 feet from the deck, close enough that I could have thrown something and hit it. I don't know what possessed me, but I cracked the screen door open a bit wider to get a better look. Maybe it was the fact that it hadn't acted threatening, or maybe it was just human curiosity overriding my fear. That's when it happened. The creature stopped what it was doing and turned its head directly toward me. Our eyes met, and I felt a jolt like electricity run through my entire body. Its eyes were large, round, and completely black, not in a scary way, but deep and intelligent. There was an unmistakable awareness in them. We stared at each other for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, and the strangest feeling washed over me. Peace, calmness. I wasn't afraid anymore. There was something in those eyes, a kind of sadness, but also kindness. I know how that sounds, but I'm just telling you what I felt. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that this creature meant no harm. Not to me, not to Clayton, not to anyone. After our eye contact, the creature simply turned back to what it had been doing before, as if satisfying its curiosity about who was watching. It continued examining the ground near the fence for another minute or two. Then, without any hurry, it straightened up and walked along the side of the property toward my parents' detached garage. It disappeared around the corner, and I never saw it again that day. I stood there for I don't know how long, trying to process what had just happened. Eventually, Buddy crept out from under the chair and scratched at the door to be let in. When I opened it, he rushed past me and hid under the kitchen table, still shaking. Clayton came back into the kitchen with my mom, who had just woken up from her nap. Neither of them had seen anything. I didn't tell them what happened. Not then. What would I even say? "Hey, Mum, I just made eye contact with Bigfoot in your backyard." She would have thought I was playing a joke or that I'd fallen asleep in the sun. For days afterward, I kept replaying those moments in my head. The way it moved, the brilliant white hair catching the sunlight, those eyes. I searched online for reports of white Bigfoot sightings, but most accounts describe brown or black creatures, occasionally grayish. Very few mentioned white ones, and those that did were often dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications of other animals. I went back to visit my parents dozens of times after that, always with a mixture of hope and apprehension that I might see it again. But I never did. I eventually told my dad about it. About a year later, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just listened carefully and said they'd occasionally found strange footprints on the property, but had always assumed they were from a bear passing through, even though bears are pretty uncommon in that part of Missouri. Here's where the story gets even stranger. About 3 years after my encounter, Clayton, who was then 7, mentioned something that made my blood run cold. We were talking about snow and winter activities, and out of nowhere he said, "Remember when we saw that big white monkey looking in Grandma's window that snowy day?" I had no idea what he was talking about. We'd never seen any white monkey together, and certainly not looking in windows. I asked him to explain, thinking it was just a child's imagination. "When I was little," he said, "at Grandma's house when there was lots of snow, you were making me a sandwich in the kitchen, and I saw the white monkey person digging in the snow by the trees. You didn't see it because you were at the counter, but I watched it from the window." I felt goosebumps rise on my arms. Clayton had been too young during my encounter to remember it. He'd been inside with my mom when I saw the creature. This had to be a separate incident, one I had no memory of. I asked him more questions, trying not to lead him or show how shaken I was. He described a large, white-haired creature that walked like a person, but was fuzzy all over. He said it was digging in the snow at the edge of the woods, and then looked toward the house for a minute before walking away. I went through old photos from our visits to my parents' place and found several winter trips when Clayton was around 3, a year before my own sighting. In those photos, there was indeed heavy snow on the ground. Had my son seen the same creature a year before I did? And why didn't I see it that day? I've spent years trying to make sense of what happened. I've read countless accounts of Bigfoot encounters, learned about regional variations in descriptions, and even joined online forums where people share their experiences. Some Native American traditions speak of ancient ones that live in the forests, sometimes described as having white hair when they're elders. Is that what we saw? What haunts me most is the eye contact. Those eyes contained intelligence and emotion that felt almost human, but not quite. There was a connection in that moment that I can't explain, a recognition of some kind. I've never gone public with this story until now. I know what people will say. I know the explanations they'll offer: misidentification, imagination, hallucination. But Buddy saw it too, and apparently so did my son, on a completely different occasion. I don't know what's out there in the woods of Lundo, Missouri. I don't know why it was near my parents' property or what it was looking for on the ground that day. All I know is that it exists, and for one brief moment it looked into my eyes, and I wasn't afraid. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, that white watcher in the woods, going about its life while we go about ours. Our worlds briefly overlapping on a sunny afternoon in October, then separating again, maybe forever. Maybe just until next time. Story 8. I've been fishing the Louisiana bayous since I was old enough to hold a rod. My dad taught me every nook and cranny of these waters, showed me how to read the currents, and passed down all the local knowledge about the best spots to set traps. I'm not someone who spooks easily. Gators, snakes, wild boars. I've dealt with them all. But what happened to me last September has kept me awake at night ever since, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I live in a small town on the edge of the swamp. Most mornings I'm up before sunrise to check my traps. That particular day started like any other. It was one of those typical Louisiana September mornings, already hot and sticky by 6 a.m., with humidity so thick you could practically swim through it. The mosquitoes were biting something fierce, but that's just part of life out here. I loaded up my little aluminum boat with the usual gear, some extra line, my knife, a thermos of coffee, and a small cooler for whatever I might catch. The swamp was quiet that morning. Quieter than usual, actually. I didn't think much of it at the time, but looking back, the absence of normal sounds should have been my first clue that something wasn't right. No frogs calling, fewer birds than usual. The soft purr of my outboard motor was the loudest sound as I navigated through the maze of waterways I know like the back of my hand. I had set up a new line of traps about 2 miles into a narrow channel most folks don't bother with. It's harder to access, but the fishing is usually worth the extra effort. The place is surrounded by cypress trees draped with Spanish moss, their knobby knees poking up through the water. Palmetto bushes grow thick along the edges. It's beautiful in a wild, untamed way, but that morning the beauty felt different, oppressive somehow. When I cut the motor to drift the last few yards to my first trap, that's when I heard it. A deep, rumbling grunt that echoed across the water. It wasn't a gator, I know that sound. It wasn't a bear or a wild pig either. This sound had an almost human quality to it, but deeper than any human voice I've ever heard. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up straight. I froze, with my hand on the side of the boat, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. and with it came a smell that hit me like a physical thing. Anyone who's spent time in the swamps knows there are plenty of unpleasant odors, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, decomposing animals. But this was different. There was that familiar swampy smell, but mixed with something else I can't even describe, like wet, moldy fur combined with something rotten and something musky. It was so strong it made my eyes water. My first thought was that maybe someone had died out here. Maybe a hunter or fisherman had an accident and their body was decomposing nearby. But deep down I knew that wasn't it. This smell was alive. I reached for my phone to check the time, 7:32 a.m., and to make sure I had signal in case I needed to call someone. 1 bar, better than nothing, I guess. The grunt came a third time, and I finally pinpointed the direction. It was coming from the shoreline, about 40 yards ahead of my position, beyond a particularly thick stand of cypress and palmetto. I debated what to do. The smart move would have been to start my engine and get the hell out of there. But curiosity got the better of me. I've always prided myself on knowing these swamps and what lives in them. If there was something out there I hadn't encountered before, I wanted to see it. So I stayed quiet, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on that spot on the shoreline. The water lapped gently against my boat. Sweat ran down my back, not just from the heat anymore. And then I saw movement. At first, it was just a shifting of shadows, a parting of vegetation. Then something emerged from between the trees, something big. I've seen black bears in these swamps before. I've encountered massive gators, but this wasn't either of those. This was something I couldn't immediately identify, and that realization sent cold fear washing through me despite the heat. It stood upright. That was the first thing that registered in my mind. It stood on 2 legs like a human, but it was much, much larger than any human I've ever seen. It had to be at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Its body was covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, matted in some places, especially around what I assumed were its shoulders and chest. As it moved further out of the trees, I could make out more details, though I was desperately trying to process what I was seeing. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down past its knees. The face, God, the face is what still haunts me. It wasn't quite human, but it wasn't like any animal I know either. It had a prominent brow ridge, and its nose was flatter than a human's, but not completely flat like a gorilla's. Its eyes were deep set, dark, and this is the part that really gets me, intelligent. There was awareness there, consciousness. It was looking at me, studying me the same way I was studying it. I was completely frozen, my knuckles white where I gripped the side of the boat. I don't think I was even breathing. The creature and I stared at each other across the water for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds. Then it moved again. It stepped forward toward the water's edge, revealing massive feet that had to be at least twice the size of mine. Its feet made a squelching sound in the soft, muddy ground of the bank. I remember that detail so clearly, that simple, ordinary sound in the middle of this extraordinary moment. Another grunt came from the creature, lower this time, almost thoughtful. I felt it more than heard it, a vibration that seemed to travel across the water and through my body. Then, with one last look at me, it turned and walked back toward the dense forest. Its movement was smooth, not the awkward gait you might expect from something so large navigating difficult terrain. It moved with purpose and familiarity, like it knew exactly where it was going. And then it was gone, disappearing into the shadows and vegetation as quietly as it had appeared. I sat there for a long time, unable to move. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were shaking. Part of me wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, if maybe I'd been out in the sun too long, or if the swamp gases were playing tricks on my mind. but then I remembered the smell. It still lingered in the air, and I could see the spot where the creature had stood, the vegetation still displaced from its passage. I finally managed to start breathing normally again, and decided I needed to see if there was any evidence, anything to confirm what I had witnessed. I steered my boat to the shoreline, but not where the creature had been. I wasn't that brave or that stupid. I landed about 20 yards down, where there was a small clearing that would let me approach on foot. The ground was soft and muddy, as it often is in these parts. I moved cautiously, my senses on high alert, listening for any sound that might indicate the creature was still nearby. The smell grew stronger as I approached the spot where it had stood, and then I saw them, footprints. Massive, distinct impressions in the mud that were unmistakably foot-shaped, showing a clear arch and 5 toes, but far, far larger than any human foot could be. I wear a size 11 boot, and these prints were easily twice that length and much wider. I put my own foot next to one for comparison, and it was laughable how small mine looked in comparison. The depth of the impressions suggested something extremely heavy had made them. Something much heavier than a human. I didn't have anything with me to measure them properly or to make casts, which I regretted later. But I did have my phone, so I took several pictures, trying to get different angles and to include my own foot for scale. Looking back at those photos now, and yes, I still have them, though I haven't shown them to many people, they don't do justice to the experience. They look like what they are, muddy footprints in a swamp. But I know what made them. After taking the photos, a sense of unease washed over me. I felt exposed, vulnerable. The weight of being watched pressed down on me, though I couldn't see anyone or anything nearby. That feeling you get sometimes in the woods, like you're not alone? Multiply that by 100. I hurried back to my boat, practically tripping over myself in my haste. I didn't bother checking my traps that day. All I wanted was to get back to civilization, back to normal, back to a world where creatures like what I'd seen didn't exist. The ride back was a blur. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that thing swimming after me or watching from the shoreline. But there was nothing, just the usual swamp, suddenly feeling a lot less familiar than it had my entire life. When I got home, I sat in my truck for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Was it a bear walking on its hind legs? No, bears don't walk like that for extended periods, and the proportions were all wrong. Was it someone in a costume playing a prank, out in the middle of nowhere, in a spot few people even know about? And those footprints. No costume could make impressions like that. I've spent my life in these swamps. I know what lives here, or at least I thought I did. But what I saw that day doesn't fit into any category of wildlife I'm familiar with. The only thing that comes close, the only word that fits, is one I've always scoffed at: Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it. I know how that sounds. Believe me, I do. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I'd have thought they were pulling my leg or that they'd had too much moonshine. But I know what I saw. I know what I smelled. I know the footprints I found were real. In the months since, I've done a lot of reading about similar encounters. Turns out the Louisiana swamps have a history of sightings like mine. Local indigenous stories talk about creatures that match what I saw. Some old-timers in my town have hinted at similar experiences, though most won't talk openly about it. I moved my trap lines after that day. I still fish the swamps, still make my living off these waters, but I haven't gone back to that particular channel. It's not fear, exactly, it's respect. Whatever that creature was, it made me realize there are things in this world we don't understand, things that have managed to stay hidden despite all our technology and expansion. That spot in the swamp, it belongs to something else now, something that was probably there long before me and will be there long after I'm gone. Something that, for whatever reason, let me see it that day and then let me leave. I don't expect everyone to believe this story. Hell, there are days I can barely believe it myself. But I know what I saw. And on quiet nights, when the windows are open and I can hear the sounds of the swamp in the distance, I sometimes wonder if it remembers me too. Story 9. I'll never forget that day on Indian River in the summer of 2018. It's been over 6 years, and I still get goosebumps thinking about it. I've only told this story to a handful of people, and most think I'm crazy or lying. But John was there too, and he saw the same thing I did. Me and John have been buddies since high school. We try to go fishing at least once a month when the weather's good. That particular day in July, we decided to do some bullfishing on Indian River near Vero Beach. It was supposed to be just another fishing trip, nothing special, nothing unusual. We got to the river around 6 in the morning. It was already hot and sticky, typical Florida summer weather. We loaded our gear into John's aluminum boat, just a simple 16-footer with an outboard motor, nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. We packed a cooler with sandwiches, some beers, and enough water to keep us hydrated through the day. The morning was pretty uneventful. We caught a few decent-sized fish, but nothing worth bragging about. By midday, the sun was beating down hard, and we decided to drift downstream to try our luck in a different spot. This section of the river was more secluded, with thick mangroves and cypress trees lining both banks. The water was dark and still, reflecting the trees like a mirror. It must have been around 3 in the afternoon when things got weird. We'd been drifting for maybe half an hour, occasionally casting our lines near the banks where we thought the fish might be hiding in the shadows. The humidity was suffocating, and there was this strange silence. I remember noticing that the usual sounds of birds and insects had died down. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Figured it was just the heat making everything lazy. John was at the front of the boat, and I was at the back, controlling the motor. We were moving real slow, just barely enough to keep us drifting with the current. I was taking a swig from my water bottle when John suddenly froze. His whole body went rigid, and he slowly lowered his fishing rod. "Mike," he whispered, not turning around. "Look over there." I followed his gaze toward the eastern bank, where the trees grew thick and tall. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just shadows and vegetation. But then something moved. It wasn't like the movement of a deer or a bear or anything I'd ever seen in the Florida woods before. This was big, way too big. Through gaps in the trees, I could make out a dark figure moving parallel to the river, about 20 yards in from the bank. It was walking upright, but it wasn't a person. No way in hell was that a person. "Are you seeing this?" John whispered, his voice trembling slightly. I couldn't even answer. My throat had gone completely dry. We both just sat there, frozen, watching as this thing moved through the forest. From what I could see, and I wish to God I hadn't seen it so clearly, it stood at least 8 feet tall. It moved with purpose, pushing aside branches that would have stopped a grown man in his tracks. Its body was massive, with broad shoulders that tapered to a narrower waist. I guess it weighed well over 400 pounds, maybe 450, and it was covered in hair, dark brown all over its body, with longer, almost black hair on its head. I've been hunting all my life. I know every animal in Florida, and this wasn't something that belonged here, or anywhere else I know of. The way it moved was what really got to me. It wasn't clumsy or awkward like a man in a suit would be. It moved with this fluid, powerful grace through terrain that would have most people stumbling every few steps. For what felt like forever, we just drifted, watching it move parallel to us. I don't know if it had noticed us yet. Part of me hoped it hadn't, that it would just keep going and disappear into the woods, and we could pretend we'd never seen it. But another part of me couldn't look away. It was like watching something impossible, something that shouldn't exist, but was right there in front of us. "Should we take a picture?" John whispered, not making any move toward the phone in his pocket. I shook my head slightly. Some instinct deep inside was screaming at me not to draw attention to ourselves, not to do anything that might make that thing notice us. But it was too late. The creature suddenly stopped moving. It stood completely still for a moment, and then slowly, God, so slowly, it turned toward the river, toward us. Even from that distance, I could feel it looking at us. The shadow of the trees fell across its face, but I could make out deep-set eyes beneath a heavy brow ridge. Its face wasn't human, but it wasn't quite animal either. There was something intelligent in the way it regarded us, something calculating. And then it made a sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was a low, deep growl that seemed to vibrate through the air, through the water, through my entire body. It was a warning. There's no other way to describe it. That sound said, "Don't come any closer," as clearly as if it had spoken English. The creature took one slow, deliberate step toward the riverbank. That was enough for me. Without saying a word, I reached for the motor. John and I locked eyes for a split second, and I could see my own terror reflected in his face. Neither of us needed to speak. I turned the boat around as quietly as I could, pointing us back upstream. The whole time, I could feel those eyes on my back. When we were facing away from the bank, I pushed the throttle forward, not gunning it, but definitely not hanging around. As we started to pull away, I couldn't help but look back. It was still standing there, watching us go. It hadn't moved any closer to the water, but it hadn't retreated either. It just stood, half hidden by the trees, watching our boat with those two intelligent eyes. Then, as we rounded a bend in the river, it turned and disappeared into the dense brush. We didn't speak for the next 20 minutes as we headed back to our launch point. The only sound was the motor and the splash of water against the hull. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the steering. John kept looking back over his shoulder, like he expected that thing to come charging through the water after us. It wasn't until we had the boat loaded on the trailer and were sitting in John's truck that either of us spoke. "What the hell was that?" John finally asked, his voice hoarse. I shook my head. "I don't know, man. I don't know. It looked like..." "I know what it looked like," I said. We both fell silent again. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, in Florida, of all places. It sounds ridiculous even now as I type this, but that's what we saw. There's no other explanation that fits. On the drive home, we tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear walking on its hind legs. But I've seen bears. This wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong, and no bear moves like that for so long. A person in a costume, in the middle of nowhere, in that heat, and nobody in a costume could have moved with that kind of power, pushing through dense vegetation like it was nothing. We agreed to keep it to ourselves. Who would believe us anyway? We'd sound like a couple of drunk idiots making up stories. John's a respected contractor in our community, and I work in real estate. We couldn't exactly go around telling people we'd seen Bigfoot on the Indian River, but it's been eating at me ever since. I've spent countless nights researching similar sightings in Florida. Turns out there have been dozens over the years, especially in the more remote areas. I've even found a few reports from the Indian River area that describe something similar to what we saw. For weeks after it happened, I couldn't sleep properly. Every night I'd jerk awake, half convinced I could hear that deep warning growl outside my window. I became jumpy, constantly feeling like I was being watched. My wife noticed, of course. She thought it was work stress. I let her believe that. I haven't been back to that part of Indian River since. John and I still go fishing, but we stick to more populated areas now. Sometimes, when we're alone, we'll talk about what we saw. Our stories haven't changed. We saw the same thing, noticed the same details. That's what convinces me it was real. The consistency between what we remember. The more time passes, the more I wonder what would have happened if we hadn't turned the boat around. What if we had continued downstream? What if we had tried to get closer, to get a better look? Would it have hidden, or would it have done something else? There was a power in that creature, a physical strength that was obvious even from a distance. If it had wanted to reach our boat to stop us from leaving, I don't think we could have done anything about it. I've thought about going back with a camera, maybe a better boat, something faster just in case. But then I remember those eyes, that intelligence. It knew we were there. It chose to warn us away rather than hide. What does that mean? Was it protecting something, marking territory? Or was it just saying, "This is my space and you're not welcome here"? The strangest part is that I don't feel like we were in the presence of something evil or malicious. Dangerous, yes. Powerful, definitely. But not evil. It was like encountering something ancient, something that's been there long before us and will remain long after. It didn't belong to our world of smartphones and social media and 9-to-5 jobs. It belonged to an older world, one where humans aren't at the top of the food chain. I've never been particularly spiritual or religious, but that day on the river shifted something in me. It made me realize how little we actually know about the world we live in. How much might be out there, hiding just beyond our notice. John feels it too. He told me recently that he can't look at the woods the same way anymore. Even when he's just driving past a forested area, he finds himself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that massive figure moving among the shadows. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, moving through the mangroves and cypresses along Indian River. If people drift past it every day, never noticing those eyes, watching them from the darkness between the trees, the thought makes me shiver. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Most days, I can hardly believe it myself. But I know what I saw. I know it was real. And knowing that something like that exists in the world, it changes things. It changes everything. So if you're ever fishing on Indian River and the birds and insects suddenly go quiet and you get that feeling of being watched, my advice is to turn around. Don't look too hard into the shadows. Don't try to see what might be seeing you, because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And you'll never look at the world the same way again. E.T. Story 10. I've been hunting in East Texas my whole life. Never believed in any of that Bigfoot nonsense. Sure, I'd heard the stories around campfires, seen those blurry photos, and laughed at those TV shows where they run around with night vision goggles. Always thought it was just a bunch of people mistaking bears or tall stories from folks who'd had a few too many beers. That changed on November 3rd, 2020. I'm still having trouble sleeping some nights. I keep replaying everything in my head, wondering if I really saw what I think I saw. But I know what I saw, and I can't explain it. My son Jake and I had planned this trip for weeks. He's 15, been hunting with me since he was old enough to hold a rifle. We were set up along the Trinity River, just outside of Livingston. Beautiful spot. We'd had good luck there in previous seasons with both deer and duck. The plan was simple. Jake would stay near the water edge with his shotgun for ducks, while I'd head deeper into the woods to try my luck with deer. That morning started normal enough. We got to our spot before dawn, around 5:30. It was chilly, maybe 45 degrees, with some fog hanging over the water. Perfect hunting weather. Jake set up his blind about 20 yards from the water's edge, and I helped him get settled before heading into the woods. "Stay put. Text if you need anything," I told him. Jake just nodded, already focused on watching the sky for the first signs of ducks. Proud of that kid. He takes hunting seriously, always has. I headed deeper into the woods, maybe a half-mile from where Jake was set up. The sun was just starting to filter through the trees. I was taking my time, moving slowly, looking for signs of deer movement. After about 30 minutes of walking, I found a dry creek bed that looked promising, lots of tracks showing it was a well-used path for wildlife. I decided to follow it deeper into the woods. The vegetation was getting thicker, lots of pine and oak with dense underbrush. Good cover for deer. I was being careful to stay quiet, watching where I stepped. The forest was waking up around me. Birds starting to call, squirrels rustling in the branches. That's when I heard it, a low whistle. At first, I thought it might be Jake trying to get my attention, but it didn't sound right. It was too deliberate, like someone was trying to communicate. Two distinct notes, a low one followed by a slightly higher one. Not a bird call, not any animal sound I recognized from 30 years of hunting these woods. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I froze, listening. Then it came again, from somewhere to my left, maybe 50 yards away. That same two-note whistle. My first thought was that maybe another hunter was in the area, trying to signal me. I didn't want to call out and scare away any game, so I started to carefully back out of the brush, moving toward the creek bed where I'd have better visibility. I scanned the tree line, and that's when I saw movement. About 40 yards away, something was moving among the trees. My first thought was, another hunter. I could see what looked like an arm waving, at least that's what I thought at first. But as my eyes focused, I realized something wasn't right. The arm I was seeing was reaching for a branch, and it was way too high up, like 9 or 10 feet off the ground. I blinked, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me in the morning light. But they weren't. Whatever I was looking at stood up to its full height, and my stomach dropped. This wasn't a hunter. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. It was massive. Tall. I'd estimate at least 7, maybe 8 feet. Covered in thick, dark brown hair. Not fur like a bear, but hair, longer in some places, especially around the shoulders. The arms were what really got to me. They were unnaturally long, hanging almost to the knees. I stood there frozen. Couldn't move, couldn't think straight. My rifle was in my hands, but the thought of raising it never even crossed my mind. I was just in shock. The thing, and I don't know what else to call it, seemed to sense me watching. It turned slightly, not fully facing me, but enough that I could tell it knew exactly where I was. I couldn't make out its face clearly. It was partially obscured by the hair and the shadows of the trees, but I could feel it watching me. For what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, we just stayed like that, me frozen in place, it standing unnaturally still among the trees. Then it moved. It took a step backward, slow and deliberate, almost careful, not like an animal, but purposeful. Then another step. It never took its gaze off me. Then it turned with a fluidity that seemed impossible for something so large and simply walked away, disappearing into the dense forest within seconds. My legs felt like jelly. I realized I'd been holding my breath and let it out in a rush. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked down and saw my hands were shaking. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just trying to process what I'd seen. Part of me wanted to follow it, to confirm what I'd seen wasn't just some weird trick of the light or my imagination, but a stronger part, the part that's kept me alive all these years in the woods, told me to leave that area, now. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to where the creature had disappeared. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I turned and walked quickly back toward where Jake was set up, constantly looking over my shoulder. When I got back to Jake, he was still in his blind, looking bored. No ducks yet. "Any luck, Dad?" he asked when he saw me. I couldn't tell him. Not right then. I didn't want to scare him, and honestly, I was still trying to make sense of it myself. "Nothing worth shooting," I managed to say. "How about we try a different spot?" Jake looked surprised. We'd normally stay in one location much longer, but he didn't argue. As we packed up our gear, I kept looking back toward the woods, half expecting to see that massive figure watching us from the tree line, but there was nothing. On the drive home, I couldn't stop thinking about what I'd seen. And then I remembered something that had happened just 2 months earlier, in early September. Jake and I had been squirrel hunting about a mile from where today's incident happened. We were sitting quietly when the most bizarre sound echoed through the woods. It was a scream, but not like anything I'd ever heard before, not human, not any animal I could identify. It was deep and guttural at first, then rose to a higher pitch that made my skin crawl. Jake had grabbed my arm, his eyes wide. "What the hell was that?" he'd whispered. I'd brushed it off at the time. Probably just a bobcat or maybe a fox, I told him, though I didn't believe it myself. The sound had been too powerful, too primal. Now, connecting these two incidents, I was starting to think the unthinkable, that there might be something to all those Bigfoot stories after all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that figure in the woods, those unnaturally long arms, the deliberate way it moved. I got up around 2 in the morning and started researching online. I found myself watching documentaries about Bigfoot, reading encounter stories, looking at scientific debates about whether such a creature could exist. So many of the descriptions matched what I'd seen: tall, hairy, with long arms and strange whistles or calls. I came across reports from the Piney Woods region of East Texas, not far from where we'd been hunting, describing similar encounters going back decades. I've been back to that spot twice since then, both times alone. I didn't tell Jake where I was going, told my wife I was just doing some scouting. I brought a camera the second time, thinking maybe I could get proof. But I saw nothing, just the same woods, the same creek bed. Yet both times I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. About a week after my second trip back, I was getting something from my truck in the driveway when I noticed strange prints in the mud near the edge of our property. We live in a rural area with woods behind our house. The prints were large, much bigger than my boot, and had a shape I couldn't quite identify. Not quite human, not quite animal. They disappeared at the tree line. I've never considered myself gullible or superstitious. I'm a practical man. I work in construction, deal with concrete facts and measurements every day. But I know what I saw that morning on the Trinity River. I know what I heard in those woods in September. I haven't told many people about this. My wife knows. She could tell something was eating at me. She listened without judgment, just held my hand while I talked. A couple of close hunting buddies know too, though I can tell they're skeptical. Don't blame them. I would be too. Jake doesn't know the full story. I've thought about telling him, but I don't want to scare him away from hunting. It's something we share, something important to both of us. But I've noticed I'm more cautious now when we're in the woods. I keep him closer. I listen more intently to the sounds around us. Sometimes I wonder if that thing, whatever it was, had been watching us for a while, following our movements, learning our patterns. The thought that it might have been observing my son while I wasn't there makes my blood run cold. I don't know if it was dangerous. It had every opportunity to attack me if it wanted to. I was alone, caught completely off guard, but it just walked away. Almost like it was just curious, checking me out the same way I was checking it out. I still hunt that area, but never alone anymore. And I'm always aware of my surroundings in a way I wasn't before. Every unusual sound, every movement in the trees catches my attention now. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I would believe someone else telling this same story, but I know what I saw, and I'll never look at those woods the same way again. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and I'm lying awake, I can still hear that whistle, 2 notes, low, then slightly higher, like it was saying hello, or warning me. And I wonder if it's out there right now, just beyond the tree line, watching and waiting. What keeps me up at night isn't fear that I saw something unexplainable. It's the realization that all those years I spent in those woods, I was never really alone, and I never even knew it. Story 11. I've been an outdoorsman my whole life. Growing up in Arkansas, my dad had me fishing before I could properly tie my own shoes. By the time I was 10, I could track deer, catch catfish, and find my way through the backwoods with nothing but the sun as my guide. I've seen pretty much everything these woods have to offer, or at least that's what I thought until October 10th, 2021. That morning started like any other fishing trip. I woke up before dawn, packed my gear, loaded my 2 retired hog dogs, Bailey and Tucker, into my truck, and headed out to my leased property near Little Rock on the Arkansas River. I've had this lease for almost 7 years now. It's a beautiful piece of land, about 120 acres with 2 decent-sized lakes and plenty of river access. I share it with a few buddies, but I was alone that day. That's how I prefer it sometimes, just me and the dogs. The weather was perfect that morning. Not too hot, not too cold. That sweet spot in fall when the humidity finally breaks and you can breathe again. The leaves were starting to turn, splashes of red and orange among the green. I remember thinking it was going to be a good day as I pulled up to the property around 6:30 in the morning. I started at the bigger lake, about 30 acres. It's tucked away in the back corner of the property, surrounded by cypress trees and thick brush. The fishing was decent, caught a few bass, nothing to write home about, but it was peaceful. Bailey and Tucker were having a blast, sniffing around the shoreline, occasionally splashing in the shallows. They're getting older now. Bailey's 9 and Tucker's 11, but they still act like puppies when we're out in the woods. Around 11, I decided to move to the smaller lake closer to the main road. It's maybe 10 acres, but it's deeper and sometimes holds bigger fish. I packed up my gear, whistled for the dogs, and we made our way across a stretch of swampy land that connects the two lakes. That's when things started to feel off. We were about halfway to the second lake when Bailey and Tucker suddenly stopped. Their behavior changed in an instant. These are hunting dogs, specifically trained for tracking wild hogs. They're fearless. I've seen them corner boars twice their size without hesitation, but right then, they both just froze. Tucker's ears went flat against his head, and Bailey started backing up, pressing against my legs. They weren't barking, not at first. It was this low throat moan I'd never heard them make before. It sent a chill right up my spine. I reached for my rifle, a Remington 30-06 I always carry when I'm out on the property. Force of habit from hunting season, but I was suddenly very glad to have it. "What is it, boys?" I whispered, scanning the tree line. Part of me was thinking wild hog, maybe a bear, though we don't get many in this particular area. That's when Tucker's moaning turned into these panicked little yaps. Not his usual bark at all, more like he was trying to warn me but was too scared to make full noise. Bailey was trembling against my leg. I was looking across the road that cuts through the property toward a particularly swampy section that floods when the river runs high. At first, I didn't see anything, just trees, brush, shadows. Then something moved. I can't really explain the feeling that washed over me. It was like my brain couldn't process what my eyes were seeing. A dark figure emerged from behind a cluster of cypress trees, moving slowly. At first, I thought it was a bear standing on its hind legs, but bears don't walk upright for that long. This thing was walking, deliberately, on two legs. It was massive. I'm 6 feet tall, and this thing towered over me, had to be at least 7 feet, maybe more. Broad shoulders, powerful build. It was covered in what looked like dark brown hair, not fur exactly, more like shaggy hair that hung down its body. In certain patches, especially around its shoulders, the hair had a reddish tint where the sun hit it. I stood there, completely frozen. The dogs were pressed so hard against my legs I thought I might fall over. I raised my rifle slightly, not aiming, just ready. That's when it turned its head and I saw its face. God, that face. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't anything I've ever seen in these woods. The face was almost flat, with a pronounced brow, small eyes, deep set, dark. But what got me was the intelligence in those eyes. It wasn't looking around randomly. It was studying me, watching, thinking. I shifted my weight slightly, trying to get a better angle to see it clearly, and that tiny movement set off an instant reaction. This thing moved faster than anything that size should be able to move. It spun around in one fluid motion and actually leaped, I'm talking a massive bound, back into the tree line. The brush shook, and then nothing. Complete silence. Even the normal forest sounds had stopped. No birds, no insects, nothing. I stood there for what felt like forever, rifle half raised, dogs whimpering at my feet. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. I've been in some tense situations in the woods, faced down angry boars, stumbled on cottonmouths, even had a close call with a black bear once, but nothing ever made me feel like this. It was primal fear, the kind that's burned into your DNA. After a few minutes, I started to question what I'd seen. Maybe it was just a bear. Maybe the weird angle and the shadows played tricks on my eyes. I decided to check for tracks, thinking that would give me some rational explanation. I took about 3 steps toward where it had been standing when something inside me screamed, "Stop!" It wasn't a sound or a sight, just this overwhelming instinct that told me going any further was dangerous, deadly dangerous. I've learned to trust those instincts over the years. They're what keep you alive in the wilderness. I backed up slowly, keeping my eyes on the tree line, and decided it was time to pack it in for the day. The dogs didn't need any convincing. They were already heading back toward the truck, looking over their shoulders every few steps. We made it back to the main path that leads to where I'd parked, and that's when I saw it. A massive tree branch, easily 8 inches thick and 15 feet long, had fallen across the access road, right where we needed to drive out. The thing is, that branch hadn't been there when I drove in that morning. I'm certain of it. I would have had to move it to get my truck past. I approached it cautiously, looking around the whole time. It wasn't just broken. It looked like it had been snapped off a nearby oak and deliberately placed across the road. The break wasn't clean. It was twisted, with splinters pointing in all directions. It took me nearly 20 minutes to drag it far enough off the road so I could get my truck through, and the whole time I felt like I was being watched. The dogs wouldn't get out of the truck while I moved the branch. They just sat there, staring into the woods, occasionally making those strange, whimpering sounds. Once I cleared the branch, I threw my gear in the back haphazardly, didn't even break down my fishing rod properly, and we got the hell out of there. I drove faster than I should have on those dirt roads, not slowing down until I hit the highway. I've been back to the property since then, but never alone, and never without my rifle within arm's reach. I haven't seen anything like that again, but sometimes the dogs refuse to get out of the truck in certain areas, particularly near that swampy section. I've never told the other guys who share the lease about what happened. They'd either think I've lost my mind, or they'd laugh it off. But I know what I saw, those eyes. They're burned into my memory, the intelligence behind them, the way it moved. No bear or person moves like that. I've done some research since then, read about other sightings in the area over the years. People talk about Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I always thought those were stories for campfires and bad television shows. I'm not saying that's what I saw, but I'm also not saying it wasn't. I just know it was something that shouldn't exist in those woods. The fallen branch bothers me the most. It feels deliberate, like a message, like it was telling me this is its territory, and I was the intruder. I've hunted my whole life, and I've never felt like prey until that day. Sometimes at night, especially when I'm alone, I hear those whimpers my dogs made. That's not a sound you forget. It was fear in its purest form, from animals that don't scare easily. Whatever they sensed that day, they recognized it as something to be feared. I still fish that property. I still hunt there during season. But I'm different now. More cautious, always watching the tree line, always listening for that silence that falls when something's not right. I carry a camera with me now too, though I doubt I'll ever be quick enough to get a picture if I see it again. Last month, I found some strange tracks near the smaller lake. Not clear prints, just depressions in the mud, like something heavy had walked there, something with a stride much longer than mine. I didn't follow them. Some questions are better left unanswered. I don't know what's out there in those woods. Maybe it's something science hasn't classified yet. Maybe it's something that's managed to stay hidden all these years. All I know is that on October 10th, 2021, I came face to face with something that shouldn't exist, something that looked at me with eyes that held too much understanding. And some days, when the wind is right and the woods go quiet, I swear I can feel those eyes on me again. I've spent my whole life in these forests. I know every animal track, every bird call, every snake hole and deer trail. But that day reminded me that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that exist in the shadows of our knowledge. And sometimes, just sometimes, they step into the light long enough for someone like me to see them. The scariest part? I get the feeling it wanted me to see it. It could have stayed hidden, but it chose to show itself. Why? That's the question that keeps me up at night. I still haven't told anyone who'd recognize the location. Some places deserve their secrets, and some creatures deserve their privacy. But I needed to tell someone, even strangers on the internet who might think I'm crazy or lying. I'm not. I wish I was. I wish I could explain it away as a bear, or a person in a costume, or a hallucination. But I can't. It was real as the ground beneath my feet, as real as the fear that still creeps up my spine when I think about those intelligent eyes studying me from across the swamp. Whatever it was, it belongs to those woods in a way I never will. I'm just passing through. It lives there, and somehow it knows the difference. Story 12. It was November 18th, 2022. I remember the date clearly because I'd been working double shifts that week at the Douglas construction facility out near Asheville. It's this big operation where they store equipment and materials for the highway expansion project. Nothing exciting, just trailers, bulldozers, cement mixers, and building supplies spread across about 5 acres with a forest line that backs up to the property. That night, temperatures had dropped into the low 30s. You know that bone-chilling cold that makes the metal railings stick to your skin when you touch them? That kind of cold. I was working with Daryl, who'd only been with the company for about 3 months. Good guy, ex-military, takes the job seriously like I do. Our shift started at 10 p.m., and for the first few hours, it was business as usual. We'd do our rounds every hour, check the gate, walk the perimeter, look for any signs of tampering with the equipment. Between rounds, we'd sit in the security trailer, watching the monitors, drinking coffee that tasted like it had been sitting in the pot since the Reagan administration. Around 2:15 in the morning, we headed out for another patrol. The facility lighting wasn't great. Budget cuts meant half the floodlights were out, creating these weird shadows that played tricks on your eyes if you stared too long. We had our flashlights, of course, but even those only cut so far into the darkness. We separated briefly. I took the north side of the lot. Daryl took the south. I was checking between some storage containers when I heard Daryl's radio crackle. "Marcus, you need to see this," he said, his voice different somehow. Not panicked exactly, but tense in a way I hadn't heard before. I jogged over to the parking area where Daryl was standing completely still, just staring toward the line of construction trailers about 30 yards away. I was about to ask what he was looking at when I saw it. My first thought was, why is someone walking around out here? But within seconds, I knew this wasn't a person, not in any normal sense. This figure was moving slowly along the edge of the trailers, heading toward the tree line. The motion immediately struck me as wrong. It was way too tall. I'd estimate at least 7 feet, maybe taller, and the proportions were off. Its shoulders were massive like a linebacker wearing football pads, but natural, part of its body. The head sat directly on those shoulders, barely any neck visible from my angle. But the walking, that's what really got me. Each stride covered way more ground than should be possible. It moved fluidly, but with this slight hunched posture, arms swinging in a way that reminded me of those nature documentaries showing great apes walking. Except this thing was completely upright on 2 legs. The security lights created this silhouette effect, so I couldn't make out features clearly, but I could see dark hair or fur covering its body. It was thick, not like a person in a coat, but like something naturally bulky. "What the hell is that?" Daryl whispered, though I don't know why he bothered keeping his voice down. We were far enough away that no normal person would have heard us. I didn't answer because I honestly had no idea what to say. My mind was racing through possibilities. Bear on hind legs, some extreme bodybuilder trespassing. But none of those explanations fit what I was seeing. The strangest part was that it never turned to look at us directly, yet somehow I felt with absolute certainty that it knew we were there. It's hard to explain, but it was like when you can feel someone watching you in a crowd. That awareness. The hairs on my arms stood up despite my heavy jacket. We stood frozen for maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like forever. Then some instinct kicked in. The training, I guess. I pulled out my phone and started recording, but between the distance and poor lighting, I knew it wouldn't capture much. Daryl unholstered his pepper spray. Pretty useless given the distance, but I understood the impulse to have something, anything, in hand. The figure reached the edge of the property and without hesitation disappeared into the tree line. No looking back, no rush, just this deliberate movement like it had someplace specific to go. "We need to report this," I said finally, my voice sounding strange even to my own ears. Daryl nodded, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the figure had vanished. "Yeah. But report what exactly?" "Good question. What do you tell dispatch? That you saw a giant walking across the construction site? That you think Bigfoot just strolled through your security patrol?" I made the call anyway, trying to keep my voice professional as I reported an unauthorized individual on the property. The dispatcher, Sheila, I recognized her voice from previous calls, asked for a description. "Male, very tall, at least 7 feet. I paused. "Wearing dark clothing, entered the woods on the east side of the property." There was this slight hesitation on her end. 7 feet tall? Are you sure about that?" "Affirmative," I said, sticking to protocol language to hide how rattled I felt. "Request officers to check the perimeter." She said they'd send someone, but I could tell from her tone she wasn't taking it seriously. Can't blame her, really. If someone called me with that description, I'd probably think they were seeing things too. Daryl and I decided to check the area where the figure had been walking. Standard procedure, though everything about this felt anything but standard. We moved cautiously, flashlights sweeping the ground. I was looking for footprints mostly, some confirmation of what we'd seen. There was nothing. The ground was hard-packed gravel in that area, so maybe that explained it. Still, something that size should have left some trace. We walked to the tree line, but stopped short of entering the woods. Company policy prohibited leaving the property during shifts, and honestly, I had zero desire to go into that darkness. The forest felt different now, threatening in a way it never had before. "You ever see anything like that before?" Daryl asked, his flashlight beam dancing nervously along the edge of the trees. "No," I answered honestly. "Never." We waited there for the police, standing closer together than we normally would. Neither of us spoke much, but I could tell Daryl was processing the same questions I was. What moves like that? Why was it here? Where did it go? The cops showed up about 20 minutes later, 2 officers in a patrol car. They didn't seem particularly concerned as we explained what we'd seen. The older officer, Ramirez, according to his nameplate, listened patiently, but I could see the skepticism in his face. "Probably a bear," he suggested. "They stand on their back legs sometimes, can look surprisingly human-like. I've seen bears, plenty of them in these parts. This wasn't a bear. It was walking upright the entire time," I explained. "Moving like a person, but not a person." The younger officer, Garcia, was shining his flashlight toward the woods, not really engaged in the conversation. "No footprints? No signs of forced entry anywhere?" "Nothing," Daryl confirmed. Ramirez scratched his chin. "Could have been shadows playing tricks. Those security lights create some weird effects sometimes." They took our statements anyway, probably more to humor us than anything else. Before leaving, Ramirez said, "You boys be careful out here. Call again if you see anything else unusual." The way he said unusual made it clear he thought we were either seeing things or overreacting to a deer or some other normal forest animal. After they left, Daryl and I had to finish our shift. 4 more hours to go. We decided to stick together for the rest of the night. Neither of us said it out loud, but we both knew why. I kept finding my eyes drawn to that tree line, searching for movement. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every rustle of branches in the light wind made me tense up. The rational part of my brain tried to talk me down. Maybe it was just a really tall person trespassing. Maybe it was some kind of optical illusion caused by the poor lighting. But I knew better. Whatever we saw wasn't human. Around 4 in the morning, we were sitting in the security trailer watching the monitors when all the exterior cameras on the east side went out simultaneously, just static. My heart practically jumped into my throat. "System glitch?" Daryl suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. I checked the system. 3 cameras all failing at once was not normal. I radioed maintenance, but of course, no one was on duty at that hour. They said they'd send someone in the morning. We had no choice but to go check it out. Protocol again. If cameras fail, you physically inspect the area. I've never hated protocol more than at that moment. We geared up, taking everything we could. Flashlights, radios, pepper spray. I even grabbed the fire extinguisher from the wall. Not much of a weapon, but it was heavy and made me feel marginally better. Outside, the temperature had dropped even further. Our breath came out in thick clouds as we moved toward the east side. The cameras were mounted on poles, spaced about 50 yards apart, covering the entire edge of the property facing the forest. The first camera looked fine physically, no obvious damage. Same with the second. At the third camera, though, we found something that made my stomach drop. The housing had been twisted. The metal actually bent, like someone had grabbed it and wrenched it sideways. This wasn't vandalism with a baseball bat or rock. The metal was deformed in a way that would require tremendous strength. "Jesus," Daryl muttered, shining his flashlight on the damaged camera. "What could do that?" I was about to respond when we both heard it, a deep, rumbling sound from the woods. Not quite a growl, not quite a grunt. Something between the two that resonated in a way that seemed to vibrate in my chest. It was brief, but unmistakable. We both instinctively turned toward the sound. Flashlights pointed into the darkness between the trees. The beams only penetrated about 15 feet before the dense foliage swallowed the light. That's when I noticed the smell, like wet dog and something else, musky and wild. The kind of odor that triggers something primitive in your brain, telling you you're in the presence of a predator. "We should get back to the trailer," I said quietly, already taking a step backward. Daryl nodded, not taking his eyes off the tree line. Yeah, let's do that." We backed away slowly at first, then turned and walked quickly back to the security trailer. Neither of us ran, though I wanted to. Something told me running would be a bad idea. Inside the trailer, we locked the door, something we never did, and watched the remaining camera feeds with intense focus. Nothing moved on the screens. The damaged cameras remained offline. "Should we call the police again?" Daryl asked. I thought about it. "And tell them what? That we heard a noise and smelled something weird? They already think we're seeing things." He nodded, understanding the position we were in. "So we just wait it out. That's all we can do. 2 more hours until shift change." Those were the longest 2 hours of my life. We sat in silence most of the time, eyes glued to the monitors, ears straining for any unusual sounds. At one point, I thought I saw movement on one of the screens. Something large passing between 2 trailers, but it was gone before I could be sure. When 6 a.m. finally came, we practically ran to our cars. The morning shift guys, Mike and Trevor, noticed something was off, but we just said we'd had equipment issues during the night. I didn't want to be labeled as the guy who sees monsters in the shadows. Security work doesn't leave much room for that kind of reputation. I thought maybe in the daylight, with some sleep, the whole thing would seem less terrifying. Maybe I'd convince myself it was just a bizarre combination of shadows and imagination. But driving home, the sun just starting to rise over the mountains, I couldn't shake the image of that figure. The unnatural stride, those impossibly broad shoulders, the absolute certainty that it had been aware of us the entire time. I tried researching later that day, looking up local wildlife, trying to find some explanation. Eventually, I found myself on forums about Bigfoot sightings in the Appalachians. I'd always dismissed that stuff as nonsense for gullible tourists and conspiracy theorists, but now I was reading accounts that described exactly what we'd seen. The height, the movement, even the smell. Some people called it a Sasquatch. Others used local names like wood booger or knobby. I never told my supervisors what really happened. Neither did Daryl. We had a brief, unspoken agreement to keep it between ourselves. But word somehow got around that we'd reported a 7-foot intruder, and we caught some flack for it from the other officers. The company sent someone to fix the cameras the next day. The official report said it was vandalism, though they couldn't explain how someone had managed to bend metal housing that way. They installed new cameras with better night vision capabilities, which I should have found reassuring. I've worked dozens of shifts at that facility since that night. Haven't seen anything like that figure again. Sometimes I almost convince myself it didn't happen. But then I'll be doing a routine patrol near that same tree line, and I'll feel it. Eyes on me from somewhere in the darkness. Watching, waiting. For what, I don't know. I requested a transfer to another site last month. They turned it down, short-staffed, they said. So I'm still there, still walking those same rounds. Daryl quit 2 weeks after the incident, found a day shift job at a mall in town. Smart move. I don't know what I saw that night. I can't explain it, can't rationalize it away completely. All I know is that something was there, something that shouldn't exist according to everything I've been taught about the world. And sometimes, when I'm alone in that parking lot and the wind is still, I swear I can hear heavy footsteps just beyond the trees, pacing back and forth like it's waiting for a chance to return. I keep my flashlight brighter now. I stay away from the tree line. And I never, ever turn my back on those woods. Story 13. I've never really talked about this with many people. For years, I kept it to myself because I knew nobody would believe me. When I did finally tell my parents, they just thought I had an overactive imagination. My brother was too young to remember. Now that I'm older, I realize what I saw that summer day in 1986 wasn't just some bear or my mind playing tricks on me. I know what I saw, even if no one else does. I was 9.5 years old, just a few months away from my 10th birthday, when my parents dropped me and my little brother off at my grandparents' cabin for a couple of weeks that summer. The cabin was outside of Souk in British Columbia, near Otter Point. It was pretty isolated, just the way my grandparents liked it. They had this beautiful property that backed up against dense forest. To a kid from the suburbs, it was like paradise. No rules about being inside by dark, no neighbors complaining about noise, just trees and wilderness and freedom. It was late June, and the weather was perfect. Not too hot, just warm enough to wear shorts and a t-shirt. That particular day, my grandmother and aunt were preparing a picnic lunch. I remember my grandmother making these amazing sandwiches with homemade bread, and my aunt was cutting up watermelon. My little brother Danny was only 4, and he was being a total pest, running around and getting in everyone's way in the kitchen. I was bored watching them prepare food and wanted to explore. I'd been going a little stir-crazy that morning. My grandma saw me fidgeting and suggested I go outside for a bit before lunch was ready. "Just don't go too far," she warned me, like adults always do. "Stay where we can hear you if we call." I remember rolling my eyes when she wasn't looking. I wasn't some little kid who needed constant supervision. I'd been exploring the property since we arrived 3 days earlier, and I knew my way around pretty well. There was this clearing near the edge of my grandparents' property that I particularly liked. It had these huge old stumps that were perfect for climbing on, and sometimes you could see rabbits or deer if you were quiet enough. So I headed out the back door, down past the shed where my grandpa kept his tools, and followed this worn dirt trail that led toward the main road. Back then it was called Route 22, though I think they've renamed it Forest Lane now. The trail wasn't really maintained or anything, just a path that had formed from people walking it over the years. It cut through a section of younger trees before opening up into the clearing I liked. It was probably around 11 in the morning. The sun was filtering through the trees, creating these dappled patterns on the ground. I remember the way it made everything look sort of magical, like in a fairy tale. I spent maybe 20 minutes in the clearing, balancing on fallen logs and throwing pine cones at targets I'd made up in my head. Eventually, I figured I should head back for lunch. My grandma would be calling for me soon, and I didn't want to get in trouble for being too far away. So I started back up the trail toward the cabin. I was taking my time, kind of dragging my feet because I wasn't ready to go back yet. I was looking down at the ground, watching ants crossing the path, when I heard this rustling sound in the woods to my right. I stopped and looked up, thinking it was probably a deer. We saw them all the time around the property, and I was hoping to get a good look at one up close. The rustling got louder, like something big was moving through the underbrush. I remember feeling excited, not scared. Not yet, anyway. Then everything changed in an instant. Something huge burst out from the thicket about 20 yards away from me. At first, I couldn't process what I was seeing because it didn't make sense. It was moving on all fours, but it wasn't a bear or a deer or anything I recognized. It was dark, covered in black hair, and moving incredibly fast. I froze. I couldn't move a muscle. My brain was trying to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. The creature kept coming, not directly at me, but at an angle. When it got to about 15 yards away from where I stood, it did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It reached out with its left arm. I distinctly remember it was the left one, and grabbed onto this old fence post that was sticking up from the ground. In one fluid motion, it used the post to pull itself upright. It stood up, on two legs, like a person. But it wasn't a person. It couldn't be. It was huge, towering and massive in a way that made my stomach drop. Once it was upright, it ran past this small sapling on two legs. Its stride was enormous, covering ground faster than any human could. Then about 7 or 8 feet away from me, it stopped. Just stopped dead and turned to face me square on. I still remember every detail of what I saw, even though it's been decades. The creature was at least 8 feet tall, way taller than my dad, who was 6 feet and seemed giant to me back then. It was covered in this black, matted hair. The hair wasn't super long, maybe 4 or 5 inches, and it covered most of its body. I noticed its chest and stomach had less hair, though. It was thinner there, and I could see darker skin underneath. Its face is what I remember most clearly. It wasn't completely covered in hair like an animal. The hair was around its cheeks and jaw, but its face looked almost human, but not quite. It had this broad forehead and heavy brow ridges that jutted out over its eyes. Its nose was wide and flat, and its mouth was set in what looked like a straight line. The eyes, though, God, the eyes. They weren't animal eyes. They were aware, intelligent. They locked onto mine and held there, and in that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that I was looking at something that could think. It wasn't just some wild animal reacting on instinct. There was somebody home behind those eyes. The weirdest part was that it didn't seem aggressive. It wasn't showing teeth or making threatening moves. It was just looking at me, studying me, almost like it was as surprised to see me as I was to see it. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. It felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I couldn't even scream. I was literally paralyzed with fear, my sneakers rooted to the dirt path. Then I heard my brother's voice, calling my name from up near the cabin. "Sarah! Sarah! Lunch is ready!" His high-pitched little kid voice seemed to break the spell. The creature's head snapped in the direction of Danny's voice, and I saw something like concern cross its face. It looked back at me, then over its shoulder again, like it was calculating something. It did this a couple more times, looking at me, then looking back toward where the voice had come from. Then, without warning, it turned and bolted back into the forest. It didn't crash through blindly, though. It moved with purpose, pushing smaller trees aside with its powerful arms, ducking under branches and disappearing into the thick underbrush. The sound of it moving away faded quickly, which was surprising for something so large. It knew how to move through the woods quietly. That's when my legs finally decided to work again. I ran faster than I'd ever run in my life, all the way back to the cabin. I burst through the back door, gasping and crying. Everyone looked up from the picnic table, startled. My grandmother rushed over to me, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain between sobs what I'd seen, but even as the words came out of my mouth, I could see they didn't believe me. My aunt exchanged this look with my grandmother, the kind adults give when they think a kid is making something up. "Honey, there are no monsters in these woods," my grandmother said, stroking my hair. "You probably just saw a bear. They can look very big when you're surprised by them." "It wasn't a bear," I insisted. "It stood up. It looked at me. It had a face like a person." My grandfather, who'd been silent until then, put down his newspaper. "Now, Sarah," he said in that serious voice he used when he thought I was fibbing, "you know there aren't any monsters. You've been reading too many of those scary stories you like." I was furious that no one believed me. I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't my imagination, but they all treated me like I was just a silly kid making up stories. My brother Danny thought it was hilarious, and for the rest of the day, he kept jumping out from behind doors going, "Boo! I'm the monster from the woods." After lunch, my grandfather and aunt walked down the trail where I'd been. They came back saying there was nothing there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to suggest anything big had been in the area. That just made it worse. I knew they thought I was lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound from outside made me jump. I kept thinking that creature knew where I was now, that it might come looking for me. I lay awake for hours, staring at the window of the small bedroom I was sharing with Danny, half expecting to see a huge, hairy face peering in at me. The next day, I refused to go outside alone. I stuck close to the cabin, helping my grandmother with chores, even though I usually hated doing them. When my parents came to pick us up at the end of our stay, I didn't tell them what happened. I'd already been teased enough by my brother and dismissed by my grandparents. I didn't want my parents thinking I was a baby too. It wasn't until years later, when I was in high school, that I came across an article about Sasquatch sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There was a drawing included with the article, a sketch based on witness descriptions. My blood ran cold when I saw it. The broad forehead, the heavy brow, the flat nose, it was exactly what I'd seen that day in the woods. I showed the article to my parents then and told them again what I'd seen. They still didn't believe me. My dad just ruffled my hair and said, "You always did have quite an imagination, kiddo." But I know what I saw. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a man in a costume. It was something in between, something intelligent that walked on two legs, but wasn't human, something that looked into my eyes and recognized me as another thinking being. I've spent a lot of time since then researching Sasquatch sightings, especially around Vancouver Island and the Souk area. There have been dozens of reports over the years, many of them describing exactly what I saw: the height, the black hair, the surprisingly human-like face. I'm not alone. Other people have seen it too. What haunts me the most isn't the fear I felt in that moment. It's the intelligence I saw in its eyes. Whatever that creature was, it wasn't just some animal. It made decisions. It reacted to my brother's voice. It assessed the situation and chose to retreat. Those aren't the actions of a mindless beast. Sometimes I wonder if it remembers me too. If somewhere in those woods there's a creature that once locked eyes with a terrified little girl and decided not to hurt her. I wonder if it's still out there, avoiding humans, living in the deepest parts of the forest where people rarely go. I'm 37 now and I've never gone back to those woods. My grandparents sold the cabin when I was in college, and I was secretly relieved. I never wanted to set foot on that property again. But sometimes, when I'm camping or hiking in wooded areas, I get this prickly feeling on the back of my neck, like I'm being watched. And I wonder. I don't expect people to believe me. Most don't. But I know what I saw that summer day in 1986. I know it wasn't my imagination or a misidentified animal. I saw a Sasquatch face to face, and nothing anyone says will ever convince me otherwise. Story 14. I still don't sleep well some nights. It's been 5 months since that evening on Highway 95, and I'm still trying to make sense of what I saw. I've been with the RCMP for 14 years, stationed outside Golden, British Columbia for the last 6. I've seen my share of wildlife encounters, bears, moose, even the occasional cougar, but nothing prepared me for what happened on May 6th of this year. I was on a routine patrol about 16 kilometers outside of Golden on Highway 95. It was around 7 in the evening, still plenty of daylight left in early May. The weather was clear, visibility excellent. I was driving behind a Peterbilt semi-hauling lumber, keeping a safe distance as we cruised at about 90 kilometers per hour. Nothing unusual about the evening up to that point, just another shift, another patrol. I remember I was thinking about stopping for coffee at the next turnout when it happened. I noticed movement to my right, in the eastern tree line. At first I thought it was a moose or maybe an elk bolting from the woods. We get that sometimes. But the moment this thing fully emerged from the trees, I knew it wasn't any animal I'd ever encountered. This thing, and I still struggle to call it anything else, burst from the tree line at incredible speed. It was running upright on 2 legs, but nothing like a human runs. Its stride was enormous, covering ground in a way that seemed impossible. The semi-driver must have spotted it at the same time I did, because I saw his brake lights flash red as he hit them hard. His trailer jackknifed slightly as he fought to maintain control. The creature, I don't know what else to call it, cleared the entire width of the highway in what looked like 2, maybe 3 strides at most. It moved so fast I barely had time to process what I was seeing, but what I did see is burned into my memory. It was tall, incredibly tall. As it crossed in front of the semi, I could compare its height to the truck's cab. This thing stood at least 8 feet, maybe taller. Its body was massive, not bulky like a bear standing upright, but powerfully built with muscle definition, visible even under the thick hair covering its body. The hair was dark. In the evening light it looked black or maybe very dark brown, not fur exactly, more like long hair that covered everything except what I could see of its face. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Its arms were too long, swinging with purpose as it ran, and its legs were incredibly powerful. The way it moved, it had this slight forward lean, but it wasn't clumsy or awkward. It was purposeful, almost graceful despite its size. Its head sat low between what I can only describe as massive shoulders, and it never turned to look at either vehicle. The whole encounter lasted maybe 3-4 seconds at most. It crossed the highway and disappeared into the western tree line, crashing through the underbrush like it wasn't even there. I hit my brakes and pulled over, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The semi had already stopped about 50 meters ahead of me. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of my cruiser, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. I faced down angry drunks and cornered criminals, but my hands have never shaken like they did in that moment. The truck driver was already out of his cab when I approached. He was a middle-aged guy, probably in his 50s, with years of experience judging by his weathered face. He was visibly shaken, his face pale as he looked at me. "Did you see that thing?" he asked immediately, his voice higher than normal. "What the hell was that?" I tried to maintain my professional composure, but I could hear the tension in my own voice. "I'm not sure. Let me check it out." "Be careful," he warned. "That wasn't a bear or a moose. That thing was running on 2 legs." I nodded and approached the western side of the highway where the creature had disappeared. The brush was broken and bent where it had entered the tree line. Fresh breaks in branches up to 7 feet high showed its path. I followed the trail about 10 meters in, my flashlight beam dancing across the disturbed vegetation. That's when I found the footprint in a patch of soft dirt. Just one clear print where it had pushed off hard to propel itself into the woods. I placed my boot next to it for comparison and felt my stomach drop. My size 11 boot looked like a child's footprint next to this thing's impression. The print was at least 18 inches long, with what looked like 5 toes clearly visible at the front. The depth of the impression suggested something incredibly heavy had made it. I took a few photos with my phone, trying to steady my hand enough to get clear shots. Then I backed out of the woods, keeping my eyes on the tree line the whole time. That prickly feeling of being watched crawling up my spine. The truck driver was waiting by my cruiser when I returned. He'd composed himself somewhat, but he was still visibly shaken. "Find anything?" he asked. "Broken branches, disturbed ground, and what looks like a footprint," I admitted. "A footprint." He swallowed hard. "Like a human footprint?" I shook my head. "Much larger. Nothing human makes a print that size." We stood there in silence for a moment, both of us looking toward the woods. "I've been driving this route for 17 years, he finally said. "Seen all kinds of wildlife. I once had a grizzly charge my truck near Revelstoke, but I've never seen anything move like that. Nothing that big should move that fast." I nodded, unsure what to say. My training hadn't prepared me for this. "What are you going to put in your report?" he asked. It was a good question. I thought about it for a moment. "Unidentified figure crossing the highway," I finally said, "causing a traffic incident." He gave me a long look, then nodded slightly. "Smart. They'd think we were crazy if we told them what we really saw." We exchanged information for my report. His name was Terry Blackwell, a veteran driver for a lumber company based in Kamloops. As he climbed back into his truck, he paused and looked at me. "You know what some people would call that thing, right?" he said quietly. I nodded, but didn't say the word. I couldn't bring myself to. "I never believed those stories," he continued. "Thought they were all bull, campfire tales, but I can't explain what I just saw." "Me neither," I admitted. After he drove off, I sat in my cruiser for nearly 20 minutes, trying to process what I'd witnessed. My hands were still shaking as I started writing my report. I kept it vague, professional. "Unidentified figure crossing highway" was the phrase I used. I mentioned the truck driver had to brake suddenly to avoid collision. I included the fact that I'd investigated the area and found signs of something large moving through the forest. But I didn't mention the height, the speed, or the impossible footprint. I couldn't bring myself to put those details in an official report. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that thing in my mind, the way it moved, its impossible speed for something so large. I've clocked vehicles on that highway for years. Based on the distance it covered and how quickly it crossed my field of vision, I estimate it was moving at around 55 kilometers per hour. No human can run that fast. The world record for human speed is just under 45 kilometers per hour, and that's for a world-class sprinter covering a short distance. Not something maintaining that speed while crashing through forest underbrush. The next morning, I went back to the site on my own time, before my shift. The broken branches were still there, but the footprint had been partially washed out by overnight dew. It was still visible, but not as clear as the day before. I took more photos, and this time I included a measuring tape I'd brought from home. The print measured just over 18 inches, with a width of about 8 inches at the widest part. I've spent the last 5 months trying to make sense of what I saw. I've researched wildlife in the region, looking for any explanation. I've read about known wildlife in British Columbia, studied reports of unusual sightings, even looked into the possibility of escaped exotic animals. Nothing fits what I saw. I've driven that stretch of Highway 95 dozens of times since then. Every time, I slow down near that spot, my eyes scanning the tree line. My colleagues have noticed my changed behavior. One of them asked me if I'd had a bad accident there. I just told him I'd had a close call with wildlife. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the full truth either. 2 weeks after the incident, I received an envelope at the station. Inside was a newspaper clipping from the Golden Star from 1987. A brief article about a logging crew reporting a similar sighting in the same general area. The envelope had no return address, but I suspect it came from Terry, the truck driver. I haven't told many people about what I saw. My wife knows something happened. She noticed the change in my sleeping patterns, the way I sometimes stare off into nothing when my thoughts drift back to that evening. I told her a simplified version, that I'd seen something unusual while on patrol. She thinks I had a close call with a bear or a moose. I haven't corrected her assumption. The few colleagues I've hinted at it with responded with jokes about Bigfoot or the Sasquatch legends. Their laughter made me regret bringing it up at all, so now I keep it to myself, turning it over in my mind, examining the memory from every angle. What bothers me most isn't just what I saw, but how it made me feel. I'm not easily frightened. I've faced down armed suspects and walked into dangerous situations as part of my job. But something about that creature triggered a primal fear in me that I've never experienced before. It was like my entire body recognized a danger my mind couldn't fully process. The speed and purpose of its movement suggests intelligence. It knew exactly where it was going, and it crossed that highway with complete confidence. It wasn't frightened or confused. It was simply moving from point A to point B, and our highway happened to be in its path. Sometimes I wonder if it knew we were there at all. Did it time its crossing to avoid the semi, or was it just coincidence that it cleared the road before impact? If it had been hit, what would have happened? Would it have been injured, killed, or would the truck have come off worse in that collision? I still checked the local papers and police reports for any similar sightings. There haven't been any officially reported, but I've heard whispers. A hiker who abandoned his campsite in the middle of the night after hearing bipedal movement around his tent. A forestry worker who quit his job after finding trees snapped 8 feet up the trunk. Small things that most people would dismiss, but that catch my attention now. Last week, I was fueling up at a station near Golden when a local hunter approached me. He recognized me from previous encounters. I'd checked his hunting license a few times over the years. He asked me quietly if there was any truth to the rumor that an RCMP officer had seen something unusual on Highway 95. Word gets around in small communities, even when you try to keep things quiet. I didn't confirm or deny, just asked him why he was interested. He hesitated, then told me he'd found unusual tracks near his hunting blind, about 30 kilometers from where I'd had my encounter. He described prints similar to what I'd seen. He'd hunted that area for 25 years and had never come across anything like them before. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. If something like that exists, it's managed to stay hidden for a long time. Maybe we should let it keep its secrets. I think about that a lot now. Whatever I saw that day, it wasn't threatening us. It was simply crossing a road that humans had built through its territory. It's been here longer than our highways, our towns, our entire civilization, probably. I still patrol that stretch of Highway 95 as part of my regular duties. I can't avoid it. But now I drive it differently, more alert, more aware of the forest around me. I find myself scanning the tree line constantly, watching for movement. Not out of fear exactly, but something more like wonder mixed with respect. I don't know if I'll ever see that creature again. Part of me hopes I do, while another part hopes I don't. But I know one thing for certain: I'll never drive through those mountains the same way again. And whenever I hear someone dismiss the legends of something large and unknown living in our forests, I just nod and keep my experience to myself. Because until you've seen something that shouldn't exist according to everything you've been taught, you can't understand what it's like to have your entire view of the world changed in just a few seconds on an otherwise ordinary evening. Story 15. I'm not sure why I'm finally typing this out after all this time. Maybe talking about it will help me process what happened. Or maybe someone here has had a similar experience and can tell me I'm not crazy. All I know is that 8 months later, I still think about it almost every day, and I still get chills running down my spine when I do. It was September 18th, 2022. I remember the date clearly because it was my nephew's birthday the day before, and I'd been joking with Chris that I was still recovering from all the sugar and screaming kids. Chris Peterson and I have been friends since high school. We're both 35 now, and I usually head over to his place in Okotoks, Alberta a couple times a month. He's got this nice property about 15 minutes outside town with a decent-sized house and a big old wooden barn, maybe 100 feet behind it. The property backs right up to this thick forest with a creek running through it. That evening was totally normal at first. We were just hanging out watching some hockey game that I wasn't particularly invested in. Chris had cracked open a couple beers, but I was driving home later, so I was just sipping water. It was around 9:30 p.m. and already dark outside. September in Alberta gets dark early, and there was this heavy cloud cover that night, making it even darker than usual. We were mid-conversation about something work-related when we both heard Chris's dog start barking. And not just regular barking. I've known his 2 border collies, Max and Bailey, for years. They're pretty quiet dogs, well trained, and they don't usually make much fuss. But this was different. It was frantic, high-pitched, almost panicked barking that immediately made us both stop talking and look at each other. "What the hell's got into them?" I asked. But Chris just shook his head, already getting up from the couch. We both went to the back porch window. Chris flipped on the exterior lights, which illuminated part of the yard, but didn't reach all the way to the barn or the tree line. The dogs were at the edge of the light, both rigid and facing the same direction, toward this small equipment shed that sits maybe 20 yards north of the main barn. Bailey was doing this strange half bark, half growl I'd never heard from her before, and Max was just frozen, staring and occasionally letting out these sharp barks. "They see something," Chris muttered, squinting to try and make out whatever it was in the darkness. That's when I noticed it. Behind the shed, partially obscured, was something. Even from the distance, I could tell it was big, way too big to be a deer or a regular animal you'd expect to find around there. It looked like a tall, dark figure, hunched slightly like it was trying to hide or stay low. But even with the slight bend, whatever it was had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. "You see that?" I whispered, not wanting to take my eyes off it. "What the hell is that?" Chris's voice had dropped to almost nothing. I remembered I had my spotlight in my truck from a camping trip the weekend before. "I'm getting my light," I said, and ran to grab it from my vehicle. When I came back, Chris was still at the window, rigid with tension. The dogs were still going crazy. I aimed the powerful beam toward the shed, sweeping it across the area, and then the light hit it. It's hard to describe what I saw without sounding crazy. The figure was massive, covered in what looked like dark brown or black hair. Not fur exactly, more like long shaggy hair that hung from its body. And when my light beam landed on it, the thing turned and looked directly at us. Its eyes, God, I'll never forget those eyes. They were this weird copper-gold color that caught the beam and reflected it back, glowing in this unnatural way that made my stomach drop. For a split second, we just stared at each other, me frozen at the window, this creature standing behind Chris's shed. There was this moment of absolute silence where even the dogs stopped barking. Then it moved. Not like an animal scurrying away in fear, but deliberate. It stood upright. Jesus, it was tall, and walked. Not ran, not scampered, but walked on two legs toward the tree line behind the barn. Its movement was fluid, almost human-like, but with a strange rolling gait that no person could replicate. Within seconds, it had disappeared into the woods. "Did you fucking see that?" Chris's voice was shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "We need to check it out," I said, though a part of me was screaming to just get in my truck and drive home. Chris nodded, his face pale. He went to his gun cabinet and pulled out a shotgun. I didn't even question it. I was glad to have something between us, and whatever that thing was. We pulled on our boots, and Chris called the dogs inside before we headed out. They came running, still whining and looking back toward the shed. The night air was cold and still as we walked across the yard, the beam of my spotlight cutting through the darkness. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? We'd both seen something that shouldn't exist. When we reached the shed, I aimed my light at the ground where the creature had been standing. The grass was flattened in a clear path, leading from behind the shed toward the woods. There was a small bush nearby that looked like something had pushed through it, branches broken and leaves scattered around. "Look at this," Chris said, crouching down to examine the flattened grass. Whatever it was heavy. I swept the light toward the tree line, half expecting to see those eerie eyes glowing back at us, but there was nothing, just the dark silhouettes of trees and the sound of the creek in the distance. "Should we follow it?" I asked, not really wanting to. Chris looked at the shotgun in his hands, then at the dark woods. "I don't think that's a good idea. Not at night, not when we don't know what the hell it is." I was relieved he said it first. "Yeah, you're right. We should come back in the daylight." We stood there for another minute or two, scanning the tree line with my spotlight before heading back to the house. Once inside, we locked the doors, something Chris rarely did out here, and tried to make sense of what we'd seen. "That wasn't a bear," Chris said, stating the obvious. "Bears don't stand like that. And those eyes, it looked at us," I said, the realization hitting me again. It knew we were watching it. It understood. That's what kept circling in my head as we sat in Chris's living room, shotgun still within reach, occasionally glancing out the windows. Whatever we saw wasn't just some animal. It had an intelligence behind those eyes. When it realized we'd spotted it, there was this moment of recognition, like it knew it wasn't supposed to be seen and had made a mistake. We stayed up late that night, talking about what it could have been. Chris suggested a bear, but neither of us believed that. I brought up the obvious, Sasquatch, Bigfoot, but saying it out loud felt ridiculous, even though that's exactly what it looked like. "Remember when I told you about that weird feeling I got while hunting last October?" I asked Chris. "About 5 miles from here, near McKinnon Creek?" Chris nodded slowly. "You said you felt like you were being watched." "I did. I cut my trip short because of it. Couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me." I paused, throat tight. What if it was the same thing? We didn't sleep much that night. I ended up crashing on Chris's couch rather than driving home. The next morning, we went back out to look around in the daylight. The flattened grass was still visible, and we could see the path the creature had taken into the woods. We followed it for about 50 yards before the trail became impossible to track. We didn't find any clear footprints. The ground was too hard and covered with pine needles, and we weren't experienced enough trackers to spot hair samples or other subtle signs. In our excitement and fear the night before, we hadn't thought to look for that kind of evidence. I regret that now. Maybe if we had, I wouldn't be questioning my own sanity all these months later. Chris and I have talked about it many times since then. We've gone back and forth between rational explanations, a bear walking oddly, some guy in a costume playing a prank, and the impossible conclusion that what we saw was something science hasn't categorized. But deep down, I know what I saw. Those eyes looking back at me, aware, intelligent, they weren't the eyes of any animal I've ever encountered. I've been back to Chris's place several times since then, always with a weird mixture of hope and dread that we might see it again. We haven't. But the dogs still get nervous at night sometimes, staring out toward that same spot behind the shed. And occasionally, when we're sitting on the back porch after dark, we'll hear heavy movement in the trees beyond the property line. Not deer, not bears. Something that walks upright and seems to know exactly how close it can get without being seen again. The thing that haunts me most isn't just that we saw something unexplainable. It's that whatever we saw seemed to understand the concept of being observed. It knew when it had been spotted and made a conscious decision to leave. That level of awareness, of intelligence, it fundamentally changes how I think about what might be out there in the woods, watching us without us ever knowing. I don't expect anyone to believe this story. Hell, if someone had told me this before that night, I'd have thought they were crazy or lying. All I know is what I saw, and that I can't explain it. Sometimes late at night, I still see those copper gold eyes when I close my own, and I wonder if somewhere out in those Alberta woods, that creature remembers mine too.